started with a clogged drain, the kind of job Malcolm Reed had fixed 1,000 times before. But when his camera caught a glimpse of something soft, something that looked like a backpack strapped deep inside the pipes of Eastbrook Middle School, he didn't look away. Within an hour, the school's secret 6 missing students buried beneath its floors would rise to the surface. And nothing in Eastbrook, Michigan, would ever be the same again. It started with a clogged drain, nothing unusual for a man like Malcolm Reed. He'd been fixing pipes for 12 years, crawling through basements that smelled of mildew and rust, fishing out everything from hair clumps to lost toys. Eastbrook Middle School had been on his list for months, calling him back again and again for the same problem: the basement bathrooms flooding, the drains backing up, the smell of rot lingering longer each time. It was the third call this month, and Malcolm could already feel that familiar frustration tightening in his chest. He knew it wasn't just a simple clog. Something deeper was wrong with the system. His boss, Harold Benton, didn't care. "Just snake it, bill them, and get out," Harold said that morning, tapping his coffee mug on the desk like a gavel. "They pay every time. Don't waste hours digging for a problem they don't want fixed." Harold ran Benton Plumbing for 30 years, and he treated every client like a slot machine, just enough to keep the money flowing. Malcolm didn't agree with that. His father, also a plumber, had drilled a different lesson into him: if you were gonna fix something, fix it right. Water don't care about shortcuts, son. But idealism doesn't pay rent, and Malcolm had 2 kids to feed. So he loaded his tools into the van, drove across the gray, frozen streets of Eastbrook, and parked in front of a red brick school that looked as tired as the city around it. Eastbrook used to be a thriving place. Back in the 60s, factories ran day and night, the air filled with the hum of machines, and the pride of blue-collar families. But the factories left, jobs disappeared, and what was left behind was a neighborhood the city forgot. Cracked sidewalks, empty houses with boarded windows, kids walking home past corners no one should stand on after dark. The school was one of the last buildings still standing tall, but even it was crumbling at the edges, paint peeling from lockers, windows fogged with age, pipes that moaned with every flush. Inside, the smell of industrial cleaner tried and failed to cover something sour underneath, something old. The secretary smiled when Malcolm walked in. "Back again, Mr. Reed," she said, pushing her glasses up her nose. He nodded, resting his heavy tool bag on the counter. "Back again?" he muttered. A moment later, Principal Janet Hill appeared, tall, gray-haired, eyes framed by fatigue. She'd worked there more than 2 decades, seen the school lose funding year after year. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed him the maintenance request. "Same issue, downstairs bathrooms," she said. "I swear we fix this every few weeks." "You do," Malcolm replied quietly, taking the clipboard. "That's the problem." She managed a tired smile and gestured down the hall. "Earl will show you the way." Earl Patterson, the night janitor, emerged from a side hallway carrying his ring of keys. He was tall and wary, his uniform pressed, his face expressionless. He nodded once and started walking without a word. Malcolm followed him down a narrow stairwell, the air growing colder with each step. The hum of fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the concrete floor. The basement felt older than the rest of the building, like a place the world forgot. Earl stopped in front of a door marked maintenance. He jangled his keys, unlocked it, and motioned toward the back corner. "Same drain," he said flatly. "Been giving us trouble since before I got here." "How long's that been?" Malcolm asked. Earl's lips tightened. 28 years. The drain was nothing special, a rusted grate in the floor surrounded by damp tiles and faded paint. Malcolm set up his equipment, the camera snake, the auger, his flashlight. He fed the camera into the pipe, eyes on the small screen as the image flickered to life, darkness. Then water, then the usual sludge. 10 feet in, he saw hair, bits of soap, maybe a few tree roots. But then something different appeared, a strip of dark blue fabric fluttering slightly in the current. At first, he thought it was just a rag, but when he tilted the camera, the outline became clearer, woven straps, maybe nylon. It looked like part of a backpack. His brow furrowed. "That's weird," he murmured. Earl leaned in, squinting at the screen. "Probably junk. Kids flush all kinds of crap." "Maybe," Malcolm said, but something in his gut twisted. The fabric didn't look torn or decomposed like it should have after years underground. It looked recent. He slowly pulled the camera back out, wiping the lens clean, his thoughts racing. He could just snake it, clear the clog, and go home like always. That's what Harold would want. That's what every job before this had been. But then he remembered his father's voice again. The weight behind it: do it right, or don't do it at all. He turned to Earl. "Where's the main cleanout?" Earl stiffened. "That's sealed off. Old boiler room. Structural damage. Nobody goes in there." "You got a key?" Malcolm asked. Earl hesitated, his eyes shifting toward the hallway like he was deciding something. "Principal won't like it." "It's either that," Malcolm said, "or you'll be calling me again next week." Earl didn't respond. He stared at Malcolm for a long moment, then finally sighed. "Your call." He led Malcolm down another corridor, darker, colder, lined with old lockers and flickering lights. They stopped at a heavy metal door wrapped in chains. A faded warning sign bolted above it: "Danger, do not enter." Earl's hands shook slightly as he unlocked it. The hinges groaned as the door opened, releasing a wave of air so full and chemical that Malcolm gagged. It smelled like something between mold and formaldehyde, and something else beneath it. Something dead. Earl didn't move. "Told you it's bad down here," he said softly. "Yeah," Malcolm replied, raising his flashlight, "but that smell's not mold." The beam cut through the darkness, revealing an enormous room filled with rusted boilers, hanging cobwebs, and pipes snaking across the ceiling. Dust coated everything except the floor near the far corner there. Faint footprints trailed toward a square metal panel embedded in the ground. Malcolm's chest tightened. Someone had been down here recently. He crouched, ran his hand across as the cleanout cover, cold, slick, and newer than the rest of the floor. The bolts had been oiled. Maintained. "You sure nobody comes down here?" he asked. Earl's expression didn't change. "Not supposed to." Malcolm didn't like the way he said that, but he didn't stop. He grabbed his wrench and started loosening the bolts, one by one. The smell grew stronger with every turn, the air thick enough to taste. By the time he lifted the last bolt, sweat was dripping from his temple despite the cold. He wedged his crowbar under the edge, pried the panel loose, and pushed it aside. The moment the cover slid open, the light from his flashlight fell into the pit below, and what he saw froze him in place. At first, it looked like trash bags, layered on top of each other, slick with moisture. Then he noticed the shapes: arms, legs, shoes, a small hand pressed against the plastic from the inside. He stumbled backward, his stomach turning to ice. His flashlight clattered to the floor, the beam spinning wildly across the walls. Earl's voice came from somewhere behind him, sharp and uneasy. "What did you find?" Malcolm's voice barely worked. "Bodies," he whispered. "God, there are bodies in there." The basement seemed to close in around him. He could hear his own heartbeat, feel the air pressing down heavy as stone. 6 small bodies wrapped tight, hidden beneath the school for who knows how long. It was the kind of discovery that didn't just change a man's day. It changed every he thought he knew about the world. By the time the first police cars arrived at Eastbrook Middle School, the hallways were already filling with whispers. Teachers huddled near classroom doors, students pressed against windows, and the scent of bleach mixed uneasily with the cold metallic tang drifting up from the basement. Malcolm Reed sat on the curb outside, wrapped in a gray blanket one of the paramedics had given him. His hands still trembled, grime caked beneath his fingernails. The smell of the boiler room clinging to his skin no matter how many times he wiped them on the towel. He couldn't stop replaying it the moment the flashlight beam caught that pale hand under the plastic. The quiet sound his own voice made when he realized what he was looking at. He'd seen a lot in his job: rats, dead cats, once even a small dog stuck in a storm pipe, but never this. Never something human. Never something so young. The police had sealed off the basement by the time Detective Dana Ruiz arrived. She was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, calm under pressure, the kind of detective who didn't waste time on small talk. She ducked under the yellow tape, nodded to the officers, and descended into the dark with a flashlight in one hand and her notebook in the other. The air down there was heavy, thick with decay and disinfectant. The crime scene techs were already at work, cameras flashing, evidence markers scattered like small flags across the concrete floor. When Ruiz reached the open cleanout, she froze for just a heartbeat. She'd worked homicide for 20 years, seen what people were capable of doing to one another. But 6 bodies wrapped and hidden beneath a school floor was something else entirely. "Get the coroner down here," she said quietly, "and make sure no one touches a thing until I've seen everything myself." Above ground, Principal Janet Hill sat in her office, staring blankly at the cold coffee on her desk. She'd spent 25 years in this building, watching it slowly fall apart piece by piece, the roof leaks, the flickering lights, the broken textbooks. But she never imagined the rot went this deep. 6, she whispered when the officer told her. "You were saying 6. Her voice cracked on the last word. She couldn't stop thinking about all the missing posters over the years, the vigils in the gym, the parents crying in the hallway, and how each time the police had told her the same thing, run away, probably left town, she'd believed them. Maybe because she'd wanted to. Maybe because it was easier than imagining the truth. Outside, the media was already swarming, news vans, reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing. Someone had leaked the word bodies, and that was all it took. By noon, Eastbrook Middle School was the top story on every local channel, and within hours, national outlets picked it up. 6 students, missing over 16 years, discovered on their own school. It was the kind of nightmare headline that didn't fade quietly. Detective Ruiz stood over the open pit as the coroner's team carefully lifted the first body. The smell was unbearable even with masks on. She could see fragments of school uniforms, faded sneakers, a broken bracelet. The preservation was strange decomposition slowed by some kind of chemical. She crouched beside one of the technicians. "How long you think?" she asked. "Oldest one's been here at least 15 years, he said, shaking his head. "Newest. Maybe 4 or 5. Ruiz scribbled notes, so whoever did this didn't stop. The realization sat in her chest like a brick. This wasn't ancient history. This was ongoing. Someone had been killing kids here for years right under everyone's feet. Back upstairs, Malcolm was giving his statement to a young officer, who kept glancing nervously at him, like he was afraid the plumber might break. "I told the janitor I needed to open the main line," Malcolm said. "He told me it was sealed off, said no one was allowed in there. But the bolts were clean, you hear me? Someone had been down there recently. Those bolts don't turn easy unless they've been moved." The officer nodded, jotting down every word. "Did you see anyone else in the basement before you opened it?" Malcolm shook his head. "Just me and Earl. He was standing at the door the whole time." He hesitated, remembering the look on the janitor's face, not shock, not horror. Something colder, like recognition. But he didn't say that part out loud, not yet. Detective Ruiz came up a few minutes later, walking straight to Malcolm. "Mr. Reed," she said, her tone calm but firm. "You found them?" He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I didn't know what I was looking at until I saw the hand." "You did the right thing calling us," she said. "You might have just stopped something that's been going on for a long time." He looked up at her, eyes red, voice low. "You think whoever did this still works here?" Rees didn't answer. She didn't have to. That night, the police worked under floodlights. The bodies were carefully removed one by one, each bag sealed, tagged, and loaded into the coroner's van. Reporters filmed from behind barricades as the stretchers rolled out, the air filled with the sound of shudders and murmured prayers. In the crowd, a few older parents wept silently, clutching photographs they'd brought instinctively, as if they already knew. When the autopsies began the next morning, the truth became clearer. Each victim had been a student at Eastbrook Middle School, each missing between 2003 and 2018. The coroner's report confirmed their identities: Maya Carter, Andrew Lewis, Talia Brooks, Desmond Price, Isabella Cruz, and Jamal Green. All of them were bright, talented kids, athletes, musicians, honor students. The kind of kids teachers brag about when they talk about hope for the future. Their disappearance had been treated as runaways, one by one, until the cases went cold. The system had looked the other way. Detective Ruiz spent hours combing through old reports, flipping through case files filled with dust and indifference. Each missing child had been last seen on school grounds, usually after practice or club meetings. Each had vanished without a trace. And every time, the same name appeared in the background of the investigation reports: Earl Patterson, the school's night janitor, listed as the last person to see at least 3 of the students alive. He'd given statements, unlocked doors, helped search the hallways. No one had ever looked twice. Ruiz requested his employment records: 28 years of uninterrupted service, night shifts only, access to every key, every door, every locked room. It was almost too perfect. She called for a search warrant before the sun even set. Meanwhile, Eastbrook was boiling with anger. Protesters gathered outside the police station demanding answers. How could 6 children go missing from one school without anyone noticing? The mayor called an emergency press conference, promising justice, reform, accountability, the usual words people say when the truth is too ugly to face. But Ruiz knew better. She'd seen the pattern before. The city cared now because the story had gone national. Not because these kids were gone, but because people were watching. When they entered Earl Patterson's house the next morning, it was spotless, neat, organized, unnervingly clean. The living room walls were bare except for one thing: a row of framed photographs of the school, each one labeled with a year. In the basement, behind a false wall, they found what Ruiz later called the Museum of Loss. A display of trophies, medals, and personal belongings: Maya's jersey, Andrew's debate gavel, Talia's choir medal, Desmond's football, Isabella's science ribbon, Jamal's club button, 6 relics from 6 lives. Ruiz stood there in the silence of that basement, her stomach turning, her jaw tight. It wasn't just murder, it was ideology. This man hadn't killed out of rage or impulse. He'd killed with purpose. When they took Patterson into custody that afternoon, he didn't resist. He simply held out his wrists and said, "Took you long enough." Back at the station, Ruiz sat across from him in the interview room, the recorder light blinking red. "Why them?" she asked quietly. Patterson smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth twitching like a dying muscle. "They were the future," he said. "I didn't like where the future was going." Ruiz didn't respond. She'd heard monsters before, but this one didn't roar, he whispered. By the end of that week, Eastbrook wasn't just mourning. It was waking up. Teachers, parents, and neighbors filled the gym for a candlelight vigil. 6 empty chairs lined up at the front of the stage. And in the back of the room, Malcolm Reed stood quietly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, listening as the crowd sang Amazing Grace. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt hollow. He hadn't meant to uncover a nightmare. He'd only meant to do his job right, but maybe that was the point. In a world where everyone looks the other way, sometimes doing your job right is what saves lives. The trial of Earl Patterson began 8 months after the discovery in the Eastbrook Middle School basement. But for most people in town, the shock hadn't faded. Eastbrook was a small city where everyone knew someone connected to the school: an aunt who'd worked in the cafeteria, a cousin who'd played football, a neighbor whose child had once sat in those same classrooms. The idea that 6 children had been murdered beneath that building, year after year, while everyone went about their lives, had left a wound that wouldn't heal. When the courthouse doors opened on the first day, a crowd of parents, reporters, and activists flooded the steps. The air outside was thick with anger and grief. Homemade signs read "Justice for the 6" and "Never Again in Eastbrook." Cameras clicked like insects as Earl was escorted inside in shackles, head down, expression blank. He didn't look like the monster people imagined, just an aging man with a gray beard and sunken eyes, wearing a prison jumpsuit the color of concrete. But that, Detective Dana Ruiz thought as she watched him from the hallway, was the most terrifying part. Monsters didn't always look like monsters. Inside the courtroom, the families of the victims filled the first 2 rows. They sat shoulder to shoulder, holding hands, clutching photos of their children. Maya Carter's mother, Lorraine, wore her daughter's basketball jersey over her sweater. Andrew Lewis's father kept a folded debate program in his coat pocket. They had all waited years for answers, some nearly 2 decades, and now they wanted to see the man responsible forced to face what he'd done. The prosecutor, Aaron Lyle, was young but relentless, known for his methodical style and his refusal to sensationalize. The evidence, he told the jury in his opening statement, isn't complicated. It's horrifyingly simple. For 16 years, Earl Patterson used his access to Eastbrook Middle School to lure, murder, and conceal 6 students. He hid them in the one place no one would ever look, the drainage system he maintained himself. He documented everything. He kept souvenirs. He bragged about it in coded online messages. And he did it because he believed those children represented a future he wanted to destroy. Lyle clicked a remote, and the first slide appeared on the screen behind him, a photograph of the boiler room, the rusted pipes, the open cleanout. Then, one by one, the faces of the victims appeared. Smiling school portraits, bright eyes, youth frozen in time. The courtroom went silent except for the faint whir of the projector. These 6 children, Lyle said quietly, were brilliant, kind, and full of promise. Their only crime was being born into a world that a man like Earl Patterson couldn't stand to see them succeed in. The defense attorney, Marianne Decker, tried to paint a different picture. She spoke softly, invoking words like trauma and possessed, reminding the jury that Patterson was a Vietnam veteran who had seen unspeakable things overseas. She claimed he'd suffered untreated mental illness for decades, that he was delusional, not hateful. But that argument shattered the moment the prosecution introduced the contents of his computer. Detective Ruiz took the stand to explain what they'd found: folders labeled by name, timestamps matching each disappearance, notes written in chilling detail. May 17, 2003. M. Carter stayed late after practice. Told her I needed help with a leak. She trusted me. They always do. The courtroom gasped when Ruiz read the entry aloud. The parents wept. Even the bailiff looked away. There were 6 entries, 1 for each victim. Each described not only the act but the reasoning, his twisted logic about purity, order, and preserving tradition. Ruiz kept her composure through most of it, but when she reached the last entry, Jamal Green, only 14 years old, leader of a student club called Unity Voices, her voice cracked. The log said he talked too much about change, about equality, about pride. I showed him silence. Ruiz set the paper down and looked at Patterson across the room. His face was unreadable, eyes cold, mouth slightly curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. The next witness was Lorraine Carter, Maya's mother. She took the stand in a navy dress and carried her daughter's basketball, scuffed and faded from years of practice. Her hands trembled as she was sworn in. The prosecutor approached gently. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "can you tell the court about your daughter?" Lorraine looked at the jury, her eyes wet but steady. "Maya was my only child," she said softly. "She wanted to play for the University of Michigan. She used to get up at 5 in the morning to practice in the snow. She said she wanted to make me proud. She already did." She paused, breathing shakily. "The night she disappeared, I was cooking dinner. She called to say she was staying late to shoot a few more free throws. She never came home. For 16 years I thought maybe she ran away. Maybe she got lost. Maybe she was alive somewhere. But she was right there under that school." She turned toward Patterson. "You put her there. You watched me come to the school crying. You told me she'd probably come back. You lied." Her words hit the room like thunder. Patterson didn't flinch. He sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed on a spot on the floor. The prosecutor let the silence hang before thanking Lorraine and letting her step down. When the next parents spoke, Andrew's father, Talia's grandmother, Desmond's mother, their stories echoed hers. The same faith, the same heartbreak. The same betrayal by a system that had written their children off because of where they lived and what they looked like. When it was time for the defense to call its witnesses, the atmosphere changed. Decker argued that Earl had been a product of neglect, a man who returned from war only to find his city unrecognizable. His community transformed. She said he snapped, that he was lost in a delusion about preserving something that no longer existed. But under cross-examination, Rose's testimony crushed that narrative. He didn't snap, she said firmly. He planned. He stalked. He documented. This wasn't insanity. This was ideology. The prosecution also introduced online posts from forums Patterson had used over the years, angry rants about demographic changes, coded hate speech, comments about cleaning up schools and restoring order. The jurors shifted uncomfortably as they listened. There was no question now what had motivated him. It wasn't madness, it was hate. On the 9th day of the trial, the court allowed a recess for the families to give victim statements. It was the hardest part. They spoke not just of grief, but of guilt. They talked about birthdays that never came, empty chairs at graduations, the quiet that fills a home after hope dies. When Lisa Green, Jamal's mother, took the microphone, she didn't cry. Her voice was strong, trembling with rage and gray in equal measure. My son believed in this country, she said. He believed in justice. He believed in voices being heard. He thought he could change things. He never got the chance, but maybe we can change something now. The final moment came when the judge, Ellen Rosenthal, returned from recess to deliver sentencing. She looked at Patterson with visible disgust. Mr. Patterson, she said, her voice steady but laced with anger, you took 6 lives for no reason other than prejudice. You used your position to hunt children who trusted you. You showed no remorse, no humanity, and no understanding of the suffering you caused. I am sentencing you to 6 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. You will die in prison, and you will die alone. The courtroom erupted in muffled sobs, and for the first time in months, the families exhaled not joy, not relief, but the exhausted breath of people who had finally reached the end of a nightmare. Outside, the crowd cheered when the verdict was announced, but Malcolm Reed didn't stay to watch. He'd testified briefly about what he'd found, how he'd insisted on opening that sealed door when everyone told him not to. People called him a hero, but he never felt like one. He drove home quietly that evening, the sound of the city's celebration fading behind him. At a stoplight, he looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror and thought about those 6 faces on the projector. He wondered how many more like them were still out there, children forgotten, ignored, lost in the cracks of a system too careless to see. In the months that followed, Eastbrook began to rebuild. The school district renamed Eastbrook Middle to the Legacy 6 Academy, erecting a memorial in front of the building, 6 bronze figures of children. Each captured mid-motion, one holding a basketball, another reaching for a star, another singing. The plaques beneath read simple words: they dreamed. They mattered. They will be remembered. At the dedication, Detective Ruiz stood beside Malcolm, watching the families lay flowers at the statue's feet. You did good, Reed, she said quietly. He shook his head. No, I just did my job, she smiled faintly. That's what good looks like sometimes. That night, under the soft glow of streetlights, the town sang Amazing Grace. The voices rose, cracked, and carried over the empty streets, the same streets that had once swallowed 6 children without a trace. This time Eastbrook was listening. By the time winter came back around, Eastbrook had begun to change. The banners from the memorial still hung along Main Street, their colors faded by snow and sun, but the spirit behind them hadn't dimmed. For the first time in decades, people in the city were talking about rebuilding, not just buildings but trust in the schools, in the police, in each other. Yet for Malcolm Reed, the man who'd pulled the truth from beneath the ground, the change felt quieter, heavier, like a shadow that followed him home. Every time he fixed a pipe or opened a drain, the smell of that boiler room came back, the chemical stench, the faint sweetness of decay. It clung to him, no matter how many showers he took, no matter how many new jobs he did. He told himself it was just in his head, but some nights he still woke up coughing. convinced he could taste it in the back of his throat. After the trial, the city offered Malcolm a new job, head of maintenance for the entire Eastbrook School District. The mayor had called it a symbolic step toward doing things right, and for once, the phrase didn't sound like empty politics. Malcolm accepted, not because of the pay, it wasn't much better than plumbing, but because it gave him purpose. He would oversee the inspection of every drainage line, every boiler room, every hidden space in all 120 schools across the district. The job wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. No more sealed doors, he told his crew on the first day. If a room's locked, we open it. If something smells wrong, we dig until we find out why. They nodded, some inspired, others just wanting to clock their hours. But Malcolm meant it. He wasn't about to let another secret rot beneath his feet. His first inspection was, fittingly, at the old Eastbrook Middle School, now renamed the Legacy 6 Academy. The new principal, a woman named Renee Matthews, met him in the front hall. She was young, bright-eyed, and determined to restore faith in a place once defined by horror. "We're trying to make it a safe space again," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous energy in her eyes. "The kids still talk about what happened. Some of them leave flowers at the memorial every morning before class." Malcolm nodded. They should never forget." She smiled faintly. "That's what we were hoping. To remember but also to move forward." The basement had been renovated since the investigation. The pipes replaced, walls painted, the old boiler room converted into a small museum honoring the 6 victims. Photographs lined the walls, Maya with her basketball, Andrew in his debate suit, Talia singing at a school concert, Desmond in his football gear, Isabella at a science fair, Jamal smiling with his Unity Voices banner. Beneath each photo hung a plaque engraved with their birth and death years, followed by a simple line, "You are seen. You are remembered." Malcolm stood in that room for a long time, his flashlight off, the hum of the new heating system echoing softly above. It was cleaner now, brighter, but the air still carried a whisper of what had been. He knelt near the spot where the drain used to be, his hand brushing against the new concrete. "You're safe now," he murmured, not sure who he was talking to, the kids, himself, or the city. After that day, Malcolm's work became something larger than maintenance. He visited schools in every corner of Eastbrook, from the crumbling neighborhoods near the factories to the newer ones on the outskirts. What he found shocked him, not bodies, not horrors like the past, but neglect. Rotting pipes, corroded valves, drainage systems clogged with years of waste and indifference. Schools that hadn't been properly inspected since the 90s. No one wanted to pay for what they couldn't see, he told the superintendent one afternoon. And that's how things like this happen. It's never about the monster first. It's about the cracks that let the monster hide. One evening, after a long day at a high school on the west side, Malcolm returned home to his small apartment. His daughter Kesha, now 10, was doing homework at the kitchen table, her little brother Marcus asleep on the couch. The TV played quietly in the background news coverage of a new city program called the Reed Initiative, a project named after him to improve safety standards in public buildings. Seeing his own name scroll across the screen made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to praise. Heroes, he thought, didn't come home with sore backs and grease-stained hands. He switched off the TV, kissed his kids goodnight, and sat by the window, staring at the quiet street below. Snow had started to fall, coating the sidewalks in soft white. Somewhere in the distance a church bell rang. For the first time in a long time, he let himself breathe without the weight of guilt pressing on his chest. But peace never came easy in Eastbrook. Weeks later, as his team inspected a small elementary school on the south side, one of the younger plumbers called him over. "Hey boss," the kid said, voice shaky, "you might want to see this." Malcolm's stomach tightened. He followed the man down into a crawl space beneath the cafeteria, flashlight cutting through the darkness. There, wedged between 2 old pipes, was a small, rusted tin box. Inside they found a handful of photographs, black and white, dated from the 1960s. Children smiling in front of the same school. And among them, one photo stood out: a young janitor, barely 20, standing beside the original boiler room. His name tag barely visible but clear enough to read E. Patterson. Malcolm stared at the picture for a long time, his breath fogging in the cold air. "He's been here longer than we thought," one of the workers whispered. Malcolm nodded slowly. "Or someone before him was." The box was turned over to the police, but the discovery stirred something in him, an understanding that the past doesn't stay buried. Even when you think you've sealed it away. The evil that hid under Eastbrook Middle wasn't just one man. It was generations of neglect, silence, and willful blindness. It was a system that ignored the quiet, creeping wrongness until it became tragedy. That night, Malcolm met with Detective Dana Roos again. She'd been promoted, now heading a task force investigating historic disappearances across the Midwest. They met in a small diner downtown, the smell of coffee and fried food filling the air. "You think this means there were more?" he asked, sliding the photo across the table. Roos studied it, her brow furrowed. "Maybe not at that school," she said slowly, "but somewhere. Men like Patterson don't just appear, they're reshaped by something. A place, a time, an idea." She looked up at him. "You can fix pipes, Malcolm, but some things in this country have been leaking for a long time." He didn't argue. He just nodded, understanding too well. When he left the diner, snow was falling again, the city quiet beneath its weight. He walked past the memorial downtown, 6 bronze figures glistening under streetlights. People still left candles there every week. Some burned out, others new, flames flickering in the wind. Malcolm paused, watching one tiny light struggle against the cold. "Do it right?" his father's voice echoed in his mind. He reached down, cupped his hand around the flame, shielding it until it steadied. The next morning, he returned to work with a new kind of resolve. The inspections continued, one school at a time. He taught his crew not just how to fix, but how to see, to pay attention to the places everyone else ignored. "It's never just pipes," he told them. "It's people. It's what's hidden underneath when nobody's looking." And though the nightmares still came sometimes, the smell, the silence, the small hand under the plastic, he faced them the only way he knew how, by keeping the light on, by looking deeper, by refusing to seal any door ever again. In the end, Eastbrook's story didn't close with punishment or justice, but with vigilance. The city learned to listen to its cracks, to fix what it once ignored. And Malcolm Reed, the plumber who once just wanted to do his job right, became something more, a guardian of what lay below. A man who understood that truth, like water, always finds its way through the dark if you be brave enough to follow the leak. The years that followed changed the rhythm of Eastbrook. The city didn't return to what it once was, it couldn't, but it began to breathe again. The factories that had once shut down for good were now warehouses, call centers, and small start-ups. Murals bloomed across the brick walls of abandoned buildings, painted by local artists who used to be students at Eastbrook Middle. They painted faces, 6 faces most of all: Maya Andrew, Talia, Desmond, Isabella, Jamal. They watched over the streets like saints of a city that had learned the price of silence. Every corner told a story now, and every story began with one truth: people had stopped looking away. Malcolm Reed still worked for the district, though now his position had grown into something much larger. The Reed Initiative had expanded statewide, and he was its director. He wore suits sometimes now, carried a badge that said Inspector General of Infrastructure Safety. It still made him laugh a little when people called him sir. He wasn't a bureaucrat. He was a man who knew the sound of water running through iron pipes, who could tell the difference between rust and blood by smell alone. Paperwork wasn't his world, but he learned to live in it because it meant every signature, every regulation he enforced, could prevent another child from disappearing into the dark. He kept a photo of the old boiler room taped inside his office desk drawer as a reminder of why he was there. One afternoon in early spring, Malcolm found himself standing at the edge of the new Legacy 6 Memorial Garden, where the old Eastbrook Middle once stood. The building had been torn down, replaced by a modern structure with sunlight pouring through glass windows and greenery growing along the walls. But the garden was what drew people there. It was quiet, a circle of trees surrounding 6 stone benches, each etched with a name. Children played nearby, their laughter soft but not disrespectful, as if they instinctively understood the ground beneath them carried ghosts. Malcolm sat down on the bench engraved with Maya Carter and closed his eyes. For the first time, he didn't see her face in death, but in motion, laughing, shooting hoops. Alive in the way the world deserved to remember her. He wasn't alone for long. Detective Dana Ruiz appeared behind him, wearing civilian clothes for once. Her hair had silver streaks now, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. "You never take a day off, do you?" she said, sitting beside him. He smiled faintly. "You neither." She looked around the garden, her expression softening. "It's different now. The schools have cameras, it's scanners, visitor logs. Things we should have had 20 years ago. It's not the systems that matter," Malcolm said. "It's the people. Systems don't notice until someone makes them." Ruiz nodded. "Still, you started something. You gave this place a heartbeat again." He looked down, tracing the name on the bench with his calloused fingers. "It shouldn't have taken 6 kids to wake us up." Ruiz didn't argue. They both knew she couldn't. Later that week, Malcolm visited Northline Elementary, one of the oldest schools in the district. It had been built in 1959 and hadn't seen proper maintenance since the Reagan era. The new principal, a young woman named Charlotte Green, had called about strange smells and moisture in the walls. Normally, his team would handle it, but Malcolm had learned to trust his instincts when something felt wrong. He met Charlotte after hours. She was nervous, glancing over her shoulder every few minutes, like she expected something or someone to appear. "I keep hearing noises down in the sub-basement," she admitted. "Like footsteps, but there's no access except through the mechanical room." Malcolm nodded slowly. "Show me." The hallway lights flickered as they descended, the air turning damp and cold. The smell wasn't rot this time, it was old metal and stagnant water. Malcolm crouched near a vent and listened. There was a soft, rhythmic tapping. Not footsteps exactly, but deliberate. Someone working, or maybe something dripping in pattern. He followed the sound until it led to a wall of sealed concrete. His flashlight caught the faint outline of what used to be a doorway. "When was this closed off?" he asked. Charlotte frowned. "Before my time. The last custodian said it was condemned after a flood back in the 80s. Malcolm stepped closer. The cement looked new, too new to be from the 80s. "Who did the work?" he pressed. I'm not sure. There aren't any records." That answer twisted something inside him. He could almost hear his father's voice again. "If it doesn't make sense, it's because someone made it not to." He knelt, running his hand along the concrete. Moisture seeped through the cracks. "We'll need to open this," he said quietly. "You think it's dangerous?" Charlotte asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think ignoring would be," he replied. The next morning, his crew brought drills and floodlights. Dust filled the air as they cut through the cement wall, the vibration echoing through the school like a heartbeat. When the final slab came loose, the air that rushed out was stale but clean, no decay this time, just the dry, trapped scent of long abandonment. The flashlights swept through the space, revealing an old maintenance tunnel that stretched beyond sight. Along the walls were faded markings, names and dates written in chalk decades ago. "Class of 72, go Wildcats." And then one message that made Malcolm stop cold. "We still hear them." He crouched closer, tracing the words with his glove. "Whoever wrote this," he said softly, "wanted someone to find it." Ruiz arrived a few hours later after he called her. Together they explored the tunnel, their lights sweeping over old pipes and forgotten wiring. There were no bodies this time, no horror waiting in the dark, but the place told its own story. They found old storage crates, janitorial logs, and a box of missing student files, all from years before Eastbrook's tragedy. It was proof of something bigger, not necessarily murder, but neglect layered so thick it had become its own form of violence. Standing there in the half-light, Ruiz said what they were both thinking. "Evil doesn't start with killing. It starts with forgetting. Malcolm nodded, and covering up the cracks instead of fixing them. They sealed the tunnel properly this time, documented everything, filed reports, and pushed for new regulations requiring full transparency on old buildings. It wasn't a dramatic ending, but it mattered. As months turned into another year, Malcolm became a quiet legend in Eastbrook. Schools invited him to speak at safety conferences. News outlets ran features about the man who wouldn't look away. He always said the same thing: I didn't find those kids because I was smart. I found them because I cared enough to look. His voice carried weight because it came from humility, not pride. One evening, after a long day of inspections, he drove to the outskirts of the city, where the skyline met the industrial river. He parked near the bridge, rolled down the window, and listened to the hum of water moving below. The city lights reflected off its surface, shimmering like ghosts. He thought about how the same river that once carried waste and secrets now powered new turbines and hydro plants. Something dirty turned into something that gave life. It reminded him of Eastbrook itself, scared, yes, but still flowing. When he returned home that night, Kesha was waiting for him with a school project. "It's about heroes," she said proudly, handing him a poster with his picture glued in the center. Around it, she'd written words: brave, honest dad. He looked at it for a long time, his throat tightening. "You know," he said quietly, "heroes aren't the ones who fix everything. They're the ones who don't stop trying." She smiled. "You still try." He hugged her, whispering into her hair, "always." In the dark quiet of his living room, after the kids were asleep, Malcolm glanced at the framed newspaper article on his wall, the one that called him the plumber who found the truth. Beneath the headline, someone had written a quote from one of the memorial speeches: "Justice begins when someone refuses to walk past a broken pipe." He didn't know who had written it, but he kept it there to remind himself that the world doesn't change with noise. It changes when someone listens to what's hidden under the surface. And in Eastbrook, the city that had learned to listen again, water ran clean through its veins for the first time in years. By the time the second winter passed after the Legacy 6 Memorial opened, Eastbrook felt like a city balancing between memory and rebirth. New playgrounds stood where cracked lots used to be, murals bloomed on the walls of grocery stores and laundromats, and the faces of the 6 children had become something almost sacred, part of the town's language, its rhythm. Yet beneath the surface, unease still moved like underground water. People had learned to keep the lights on, but they hadn't learned to stop checking the shadows. For Malcolm Reed, that shadow lived inside him. Every sound of rushing water reminded him of the basement. Every echo down a pipe could twist his stomach. He'd grown used to living with ghosts. It was late February when the first new call came in. The superintendent wanted Malcolm's team to inspect side Clare Academy, a private charter school on the other side of town. It wasn't under his district, but the mayor had personally requested him. "Parents are nervous," she said on the phone. "The old rumors are starting again." Malcolm didn't ask which rumors. In a town like Eastbrook, you didn't have to. The school was small, built in 1964, with a chapel attached and a reputation for strict discipline. The headmaster, Father Coleman, greeted Malcolm in the hallway with a polite but uneasy smile. "We were grateful you could come, Miss R. Reed," he said. "It's probably nothing, just plumbing, I imagine, but a few of the students have been saying strange things. Smells, noises, drains backing up at night." Malcolm nodded, already recognizing the familiar pattern that never really meant nothing. The basement of St. Clair was a maze of concrete corridors, the kind built before safety codes meant anything. The air was damp and heavy. Malcolm switched on his flashlight, the beam slicing through dust motes that hung like ghosts. The other workers unpacked their gear in silence. As he fed the camera snake into the first drain, the screen showed the usual signs: sediment, roots, bits of trash. But then something darker flashed across the lens, not solid but moving against the current. A thin, dark ribbon. For a moment he froze, heart hammering. It wasn't a body this time. It was a rosary, tangled and rusted, caught in the bend of the pipe. He exhaled slowly, pulled it out, and turned it over in his gloved hand. Probably dropped by a student, he said to himself, but the words sounded hollow. That night, as he logged the findings in his report, he couldn't stop thinking about how easily something sacred could get swallowed by what lies below. The discovery wasn't horrifying in the way the old one had been, but it stirred something similar, a reminder that what people buried didn't always stay hidden. He took the rosary home and placed it in a small box beside his father's old wrench. He didn't know why he kept it. Maybe as a warning. Maybe as proof that the ground never really stops whispering. The following week, Malcolm was called to give a guest lecture at Eastbrook University. They were hosting a conference on public safety and racial justice in infrastructure, a topic that existed because of him, though he wished it hadn't. He stood at the podium, looking out at rows of students, engineers, city planners, all taking notes. He didn't use slides or charts. He didn't need them. "I'm not here to teach you about pipes," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "I'm here to talk about what happens when people decide some neighborhoods don't deserve to be fixed. When we start believing that certain problems are too small, or certain people are too far gone. That's how rot spreads inside the walls, inside the system, inside us." He paused, glancing toward the back of the room where a large photograph of the Legacy 6 memorial hung on the wall. "Those kids weren't killed by one man," he said. "They were killed by years of people looking the other way. I was one of them until I wasn't." After the talk, students lined up to shake his hand. Some thanked him, others just stood quietly, unsure what to say. A young girl with a press badge asked him, "Do you ever forgive the city for what happened?" Malcolm thought about that for a long time before answering. "Forgiveness isn't the goal," he said. "Accountability is. The day the city stops checking its basements again, it'll all start over." In the months that followed, Malcolm's name started appearing in places he didn't expect: magazine articles, documentaries, podcasts about ordinary heroes. People wanted to romanticize the story, to turn it into something neat and cinematic. But he knew better. There was nothing neat about trauma. There was nothing clean about pulling children out of the dark. He avoided interviews whenever he could, preferring to spend his time in the field. He'd rather listen to the hum of a pipe than a reporter's microphone. One evening in early autumn, as the sun set over the cracked skyline, he stopped by the Legacy 6 garden again. The air smelled faintly of rain. A group of middle schoolers were sitting around the benches, working on an assignment. Their teacher was explaining the history of the memorial, how it symbolized resilience and justice. When she noticed Malcolm watching from a distance, she smiled and waved him over. "Kids, this is Mr. Reed," she said. "He's the reason we have this place." The students turned, wide-eyed. One of them raised his hand. "Mister, were you scared when you found them?" The question was simple but cut through the air like glass. Malcolm crouched down, looking the boy in the eye. "Yeah," he said softly. "I was scared. But being scared isn't what matters. It's what you do while you re-scared that counts." The boy nodded slowly, the kind of understanding that might stick with him long after childhood faded. That night, Malcolm visited the river again, the same spot he used to drive to when the noise in his head got too loud. The water glimmered under the streetlights, calm but alive. He sat there thinking about the patterns that kept repeating: the rot, the rebuilding, the forgetting, and the rediscovery. He knew there would always be more work, more cracks to seal, more hidden corners to bring into light. The thought didn't exhaust him anymore. It gave him purpose. A few weeks later, an envelope arrived at his office with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a group of students standing beside the memorial, each holding a candle. On the back, someone had written in messy handwriting, "Because you looked, we can be seen." He didn't know who sent it. He didn't need to. He pinned it above his desk, next to the inspection maps and safety checklists, where he could see it every morning before heading out. When winter rolled in again, Eastbrook held its first Remembrance Week, a citywide event honoring not only the 6 children, but also the idea that communities could save themselves by paying attention. Schools hosted art projects, cleanup drives, and student-led tours of the memorial. Malcolm spoke at the closing ceremony, his voice echoing under the glow of streetlights. "There will always be darkness," he told the crowd. "But there will also always be people willing to hold the light. Don't wait for someone else to do it." As the car of local students began to sing Amazing Grace, the same song from that first memorial, the sound rose through the cold air, carrying something stronger than grief resolve. When he drove home that night, his children were waiting up, sleepy-eyed but smiling. Kesha had drawn a picture for him, a man holding a flashlight, standing at the mouth of a tunnel. Above it, in careful handwriting, she'd written, "He found the light." Malcolm smiled, brushing his thumb over the paper. Maybe she was right. Maybe that's all he ever did. He didn't fix everything. He didn't heal the world. He just found where the light was supposed to go and made sure it stayed on. And as he turned off the living room lamp before heading to bed, he whispered a quiet promise to the night that had once swallowed 6 voices whole: not again. Not ever again. The darkness didn't answer, but for the first time, he didn't need it to. The light was enough. Spring returned to Eastbrook like a cautious apology, soft rains washing the salt from the streets. The smell of thawed earth rising from the lots where factories used to stand. The city looked cleaner, newer, but scars were still visible if you knew where to look. For Malcolm Reed, the passing seasons didn't bring distance from the past, they only sharpened the edges. Each year around March, when the first storm drains overflowed with melting snow, his mind went back to that winter morning in the boiler room, the smell, the silence, the horror that had crawled up from the pipes. He'd thought time would blunt it, but grief, he learned, doesn't fade. It settles like sediment in the water, waiting to be stirred. His work had taken him beyond Eastbrook now. The Reed Initiative had expanded statewide and into neighboring counties. Cities that once ignored their own crumbling infrastructure were suddenly asking for his guidance. He drove through places that looked just like his city, old schools built over forgotten tunnels. Neighborhoods where no one remembered who last checked the plumbing. Each time he felt the same unease. Every clogged pipe or sealed door reminded him how easily tragedy hides inside neglect. But the work kept him steady. It gave shape to the chaos inside him. On a gray Monday morning, he received a call from Flint County, about an hour north of Eastbrook. A middle school there, Kennedy Intermediate, was having drainage issues in its west wing. The principal claimed the flooding had gotten worse each year. Malcolm hesitated before accepting. Flint had its own ghosts, its own history with poisoned water, its own neglect that ran deeper than any pipe. But he went anyway. He told himself he was just doing his job, but part of him knew he was chasing something, a feeling that maybe, somewhere, he could prevent the next nightmare before it began. Kennedy Intermediate sat on a stretch of land surrounded by half-demolished houses and the remains of an old automotive plant. The building was almost identical to Eastbrook Middle before it was rebuilt, same brick, same narrow hallways, same smell of cleaner and rust. When Malcolm walked in, he could feel the echo of the past pressing against the walls. The janitor, a quiet woman named Carla Jennings, led him to the basement. "We've been getting complaints for months," she said. "The kids say it smells like something dead down there." I told them it's just the drains, but her voice trailed off. "But you wanted to be sure," Malcolm finished for her. She nodded. "After what happened in your city?" "Yeah, I wanted to be sure." The basement looked like every forgotten basement in America, old boilers, flickering lights, damp floors. But something felt off. The air was colder than it should have been. Malcolm set up his camera equipment, threading the snake down the main drain. He watched the monitor, expecting the usual sludge. Instead, he saw movement, a ripple, not from water, but from something solid shifting deep inside the pipe. "There's something in there," he muttered. Carla leaned closer. "Like what?" "Don't know yet," he said, adjusting the focus. The image sharpened. It wasn't a body. It was a metal object, wedged against the corner, reflecting the light from the camera. Malcolm extended the auger, pulled gently until it came loose. When he hauled it up, he realized it was a small brass plaque, corroded and stained, but the engraving was still visible. Kennedy Elementary, 1960. In memory of our first graduating class. Carla frowned. How'd that get in there? Malcolm turned it over, his gloved fingers tracing the edges. That's what I'm going to find out. He looked around the room again, noticing a patch of fresh plaster on one wall. Like someone had sealed something recently. When was this work done? He asked. Last summer, Carla said. The maintenance guy before me handled it. Retired now. Malcolm's gut twisted. He didn't believe in coincidences anymore. He took out his flashlight and tapped the plaster. It sounded hollow. He didn't break it open, then not without permission, but the sound followed him home. That night, he couldn't sleep. He dreamed of pipes again, the way they groaned under pressure, the way the air grows heavy before truth leaks through. He woke up at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat, convinced that something at Kennedy wasn't right. The next day, he called Detective Dana Ruiz. She had retired from active duty, but still consulted for the state. You ever get the feeling it's starting again? He asked her. She sighed. No, Malcolm, it's not starting again. You read just seeing patterns because you know where to look. That's the problem, he said quietly. Nobody ever looked before. 2 days later, he got the call he'd been dreading. The plastered wall at Kennedy had collapsed after heavy rainfall, revealing a hidden cavity behind it, a storage alcove that hadn't been on the school's blueprints. Inside were old maintenance logs, yellowed with age, and something else of photographs. Dozens of them. Children lined up in neat rows, all wearing the same uniforms, all smiling the same uneasy smiles. The dates ranged from the 1960s through the early 2000s. Most were labeled with names, some weren't, and on the back of one photograph, written in faded blue ink, were 6 words that made Malcolm's blood run cold. They'll never look under the floor. By evening, the police had sealed the building. News vans were already circling, but this time, it wasn't a massacre, it was history bleeding through time. The investigation revealed that during the 1970s, several students at Kennedy had gone missing. Their disappearances were dismissed as family relocations or truancy. No one had ever looked deeper. It wasn't Patterson this time, he hadn't even been in Flint then, but the pattern was hauntingly similar. Marginalized kids, no resources, no voices loud enough to be heard. Ruiz joined the investigation unofficially, at Malcolm's request. Together, they spent long nights going through boxes of evidence and microfilm, piecing together the timeline. What they found didn't point to a single killer, but to something wider. More insidious, decades of neglect woven into the very systems meant to protect. The missing students had been overlooked by schools, police, even social services. There was no monster this time, just indifference that had swallowed them whole. That's worse, Malcolm said one night, rubbing his temples. At least with Patterson there was someone to blame. Ruiz nodded slowly. The thing about systems, she said, is they don't rot from the outside. They rot from the inside out. As weeks passed, the city of Flint reopened its own old cases. Families came forward with stories of vanished children, long dismissed by authorities. Malcolm watched it unfold with a heavy heart. He knew he couldn't fix all of it, but he also knew he couldn't look away. He offered to help the new task force draft a statewide protocol for investigating missing students. One that would force schools to connect the dots instead of ignoring them. It wasn't justice for the ones already gone, but it was something. On the final day of the Kennedy inspection, Malcolm stood in the basement again, staring at the spot where the wall had collapsed. Water trickled down from a crack in the ceiling, pooling near his boots. The sound was almost peaceful. He closed his eyes and thought about the plaque he'd found, the names, the message on the back of that photo. The ground seemed to whisper, not in words, but in a kind of truth he could feel in his bonus. There will always be another leak. The trick is to never stop fixing them. When he left the building, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, lighting the street in gold. Reporters shouted his name, asking if there was another killer, another secret. He didn't answer. He just looked at the sky, tired but certain. The world would always have its hidden rooms, its sealed walls, its forgotten children, but as long as someone was willing to pry open the bolts, to follow the sound of dripping water, there was still hope. And hope, he thought, was the cleanest thing left beneath all the dirt. Summer came to Eastbrook with a strange kind of quiet. The city had gotten used to noise, construction, protests, school bells, but this year felt different. There was a hum of calm, like the city was holding its breath between storms. For Malcolm Reed, calm was an illusion he didn't trust. He'd spent too many years learning that peace in places like this was fragile, easily cracked by the next ignored sound, the next sealed door. Still, he tried to believe in it. He spent his mornings driving across Michigan, visiting schools, training inspectors, giving speeches about accountability. He'd become the man people all called when something didn't smell right, literally and figuratively. His name was now attached to safety protocols, city grants, even documentaries. But to him, it was still just plumbing. Water goes where it's not supposed to, so does truth. One hot July afternoon, Malcolm visited Everett High, a massive brick building on the outskirts of Lansing that had been built during segregation and never fully modernized. The principal, Dean Wallace, greeted him at the entrance, his shirt clinging to his back from the heat. "Glad you're here, Mutter," Reed Wallace said. "The city made us get this inspection done before the new term starts. Drains in the gym showers keep backing up, and the smell's getting worse." Malcolm nodded, eyes scanning the long hallway lined with faded class photos. The air conditioning barely worked, the ceiling tiles were sagging, and the whole building carried that faint tang of old copper and sweat. It felt like time had stopped here, like the place refused to let go of its ghosts. When they reached the gym, the janitor, an older woman named Mrs. Prater, was already waiting. She'd been working there since 1985, and her hands bore the calluses of someone who'd cleaned up every kind of mess imaginable. "The smell started 2 months ago," she said, pointing toward the shower room. "Thought it was just mildew, but it's not going away." Malcolm crouched near the drain, flashlight in hand. The first thing he noticed was the water. It wasn't just dirty, it was tinted a faint reddish brown. "You been flushing chemicals down here?" he asked. Mrs. Prater shook her head. "No, sir. We don't even have bleach anymore. District cut that from the budget." He ran the camera snake through the pipe, the image flickering on his handheld monitor. For the first few feet, it was the usual grime. Then suddenly, the picture warped like static. The camera buzzed, then cleared. Malcolm froze. He saw something he didn't understand at first. Writing, faint, etched into the inside of the pipe itself. He angled the lens, adjusting the light. There were words, scratched deep into the iron, "We are still here." His throat tightened. "What the hell?" he murmured. Mrs. Prater leaned closer. "What is it?" "Looks like graffiti," he said quickly, pulling the camera back. But he knew it wasn't. The etching was old, corroded, like it had been there for decades. That night, Malcolm took a sample of the pipe residue to a lab he trusted. The report came back the next day, high traces of lead and formaldehyde, chemicals used in preservation, not cleaning. He sat at his desk staring at the results until the numbers blurred. It didn't make sense. Not again. Not here. He called Detective Dana Ruiz, who now consulted for several state departments. "I'm not saying it's another Patterson," he told her, "but something's wrong at Everett." Ruiz sighed on the other end of the line. "You sure it's not contamination from old plumbing?" "Maybe," he said, "but graffiti doesn't write itself inside sealed pipes." A week later, they met at the school after hours. Ruiz hadn't lost her calm edge, but the gray in her hair had deepened. She carried a thermos of coffee and her usual dry humor. "You ever get tired of finding nightmares under schools?" she asked as they walked through the empty halls. "Every day," he said. "But I keep finding them anyway." They entered the gym, the lights buzzing overhead. Malcolm pointed to the drain. "There," he said. Ruiz crouched, peering into the opening. "You think it's a message?" "Maybe," he said, "or a warning." They opened the access panel, beneath the showers a rusted hatch that hadn't been touched in decades. The smell hit them immediately, not decay, but something chemical like burnt plastic and disinfectant. Ruse covered her mouth. Jesus. They aimed their flashlights into the dark, revealing a narrow crawlspace running under the floor. The walls were coated with grime, but something glimmered faintly. Small glass jars, dozens of them, stacked neatly against the concrete. Inside each jar was a piece of fabric, some yellowed with age, some newer. A few still had school emblems embroidered on them. Malcolm picked one up, his stomach tightening. "These are uniforms," he said quietly. Ruse nodded grimly. "Samples, or trophies." By dawn, the school was sealed off, the area declared a crime scene. Forensics teams flooded the site, pulling out jar after jar, logging each as evidence. It turned out the jars contained not just fabric but organic matter, hair, fingernails, even fragments of skin. Whoever had done this hadn't killed anyone, at least not recently, but they had been collecting. The oldest samples dated back to the 1970s, when Everett High was still segregated. It became clear this wasn't one person's obsession, it was an institutional one. An ugly tradition of cataloging troubled students, preserving traces of them like curiosities. It wasn't murder this time, but it was still monstrous. When the story broke, Eastbrook erupted again. The headlines read "Legacy of Hate Found in School Basement," and national reporters descended like vultures. Politicians condemned the act, historians called it a remnant of racist pseudoscience. And the community demanded to know who had known about it, and stayed silent. Ruse handled the press with calm fury. "This isn't just a crime scene," she said during the briefing. "It's a mirror. It shows us what happens when we stop asking questions." Malcolm stood in the back of the crowd, watching it unfold. He didn't speak to reporters this time. He just felt tired bone, deep soul, deep tired. Every discovery felt like digging up another layer of the same wound. He thought about the words scratched inside the paper, "We are still here." Maybe they weren't from the dead. Maybe they were from the living, from everyone who'd been buried by neglect and forgotten by history, but refused to disappear. Weeks later, the jars were transferred to a museum archive. The school board voted to tear down Everett High entirely. When the demolition began, Malcolm drove out there one last time. He stood on the curb, the summer sun burning hot on his neck, and watched the old bricks fall. Dust rose into the sky like smoke, and for a moment, it looked like ghosts leaving the building. Ruse joined him, hands on her hips. "You ever think it'll stop?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "No," he said finally. "But maybe that's the point. Maybe we were not supposed to stop looking." After the site cleared, the city announced a plan to build a new youth center there, a place for art, education, and remembrance. Malcolm was asked to consult on its construction, to make sure no part of the old foundation remained. He agreed, but he asked for one condition: that the words from the pipe be engraved at the entrance. "We are still here." When the building opened a year later, families gathered, music played, and children ran through the halls laughing. Standing at the doorway, Malcolm read the engraving again and felt something unfamiliar: peace. Not because the work was done, but because it never would be. As long as someone kept watching the water, the city might stay clean. And in the reflection of the new building's glass walls, he could see the sky, the river, and his own tired face staring back. It was enough. The autumn that followed the Everett discovery was one of those seasons that seemed quieter than it should have been. The trees burned gold, the streets filled with the sound of rakes scraping against pavement. But under it all was a sense of unease that Eastbrook had learned to recognize. It was the kind of quiet that meant the city was waiting for the next scandal, the next headline, the next ghost. Malcolm Reed felt it too, though he didn't talk about it. He'd started waking before dawn again, restless, haunted by dreams of water running backward through pipes, by echoes of voices calling from underground. His therapist said it was trauma. Malcolm called it memory. He knew the difference only mattered to people who'd never seen what he had. Work didn't slow down, in fact it grew heavier. The Reed Initiative had become statewide policy, and his department now oversaw hundreds of inspectors, safety managers, and forensic analysts. Every week brought another call from another district with unexplained maintenance issues. Most turned out to be ordinary decay, but not all. One morning, an assistant sent him a file marked Patterson's property. The name made his stomach turn. After the trial, the state had auctioned off the old janitor's house and storage unit. The new owners, contractors clearing the land for development, had discovered something buried in the backyard. Malcolm drove out there himself. The house had been abandoned for years, its siding warped, its porch collapsed. The air smelled like damp leaves and rust. The crew pointed him to a shallow pit behind the shed. "We thought it was an old septic tank," one of them said. "Then we hit this. It wasn't a tank, it was a sealed metal box, large enough to hold a small trunk." They pried it open. Inside were bundles wrapped in plastic. Not bodies this time. Journals. Hundreds of handwritten pages, stained but legible. Malcolm knelt and flipped one open. The handwriting was precise, almost delicate. The entries weren't about the murders, they were older. Decades older. Notes about students, names, grades, comments about behavioral tendencies and racial potential. It wasn't Patterson's writing at first. The earlier entries dated back to the 1950s, signed by someone named Harlan Patterson, Earl's father. The words chilled him. These weren't the ravings of a killer, they were the meticulous records of a man obsessed with control, with hierarchy. Harlan had been a school superintendent, overseeing several districts across the region. The entries spoke about maintaining order in the educational structure, about identifying contamination early. It wasn't murder, but it was the root of something that could become it. Malcolm realized the hatred that had consumed Earl Patterson hadn't started with him. It had been passed down, institutionalized, normalized until it metastasized into violence. The evil that lived under Eastbrook hadn't been born there. It had been inherited. He called Detective Dana Ruse, who was now officially retired, but still the only person he trusted with discoveries like this. She met him at the property, her expression unreadable as she sifted through the notebooks. "It's always deeper than we think," she said softly. "People talk about monsters like they're exceptions. But look at this. It's policy, it's paperwork. Evil doesn't hide in shadows, it hides in filing cabinets." She placed one of the notebooks back into the box and looked at him. "You were going to have to tell the public." He didn't want to. He'd watched what media attention did to people. It devoured truth, turned pain into spectacle. But Ruiz was right. The public needed to see that what had happened wasn't just one man's sickness, but part of a system that had been allowed to fester for generations. When the news broke, it ignited something across Michigan. Reporters called it the Patterson legacy. Editorials filled with outrage. Teachers demanded curriculum changes. Lawmakers promised commissions. For a while, it felt like maybe, just maybe, people were ready to confront how much of the past still lived in the present. But Malcolm also saw the other side. The deniers, the angry parents who said reopening the past was divisive. The radio hosts calling it propaganda. Some accused him of fabricating the journals for attention. "You returning a tragedy into politics," one letter read. He stopped reading after that. Truth had a way of making enemies. Still, he kept showing up at hearings, at schools, at memorials, reminding anyone who would listen that forgetting was how it had all started. "We keep sealing things up," he told one audience, "but water finds its way through. Always." One evening, exhausted after another interview, Malcolm sat in his truck outside the old Patterson property. The site was empty now, fenced off for demolition. The moonlight caught the edges of the box they'd unearthed, still sitting in the back of his vehicle. He opened one of the later journals again. Earl's handwriting, this time bigger, angrier, scrawled over the margins of his father's entries. "He taught me right. He told me what to protect. I did what he couldn't." Malcolm's stomach turned. Generational poison, written out in ink. He closed the book and stared out into the dark field. The crickets sounded like whispers. He wondered how many more buried legacies lay under other towns, waiting to be unearthed by accident. In the weeks that followed, Ruiz and a team of historians traced the elder Patterson's tenure across multiple districts. They uncovered similar records, discriminatory notes, manipulated grading systems, and decades of policies that funneled Black and Latino students into lower tracks, effectively erasing their futures. It wasn't murder, but it was the same intent: to erase, to diminish, to bury potential. When Malcolm read the findings, his chest tightened. "It's the same pattern," he said to Ruiz. "Different method, same goal." She nodded. You stopped one kind of monster. Now you rechasing another." The state eventually formed the Educational Justice Commission, appointing Malcolm as one of its advisors. He didn't want the title, but he accepted, knowing what it symbolized. At the first meeting, surrounded by politicians and academics, he spoke quietly but firmly. "We can't fix this with money or monuments," he said. "We fix it by listening to what's under our feet, to what we've built on top of pain. We can't rebuild until we understand what we buried." The room fell silent. Some nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. But he knew he'd said what needed saying. Meanwhile, the site of Patterson's house was transformed into a small community park. Not a grand memorial, just grass, benches, and a single plaque that read, "This ground once hid the weight of silence. Let it be a place of truth." On opening day, Malcolm stood at the edge of the crowd, hands in his pockets. Children were running in the field, their laughter cutting through the autumn wind. It was the sound he wanted to protect more than anything, the sound of life returning to places where death had ruled. Ruiz stood beside him, sipping coffee. "Think it's over?" she asked. "Not even close," he said. "But maybe we finally started digging in the right direction." That night, back home, Malcolm opened his own notebook. It wasn't like Patterson's, no venom, no precision. Just sketches, ideas, pieces of thought. On the first page, he wrote a line that had been circling in his head for months. "Monsters don't live in basements, they live in comfort. In the silence between what we see and what we choose to ignore." He closed the notebook and placed it beside his daughter's homework on the table. The house was quiet except for the hum of pipes beneath the floor, steady and clean. He smiled faintly. That sound used to terrify him. Now it reminded him that things could flow right, that systems could be rebuilt. The past might never stop leaking, but as long as someone kept tightening the valves, hope had a chance to stay above ground. By the next spring, Eastbrook had transformed into something that almost resembled hope. The city, once defined by decay and silence, was now painted in color: murals, gardens, new schools. Yet beneath that renewal ran a quiet current of exhaustion. Justice, people were learning, didn't end with a verdict or a loss. It demanded maintenance, the same way a pipe needed constant tightening. Malcolm Reed understood that better than anyone. Every few months, someone called him to a new discovery: old files in a shuttered school, sealed rooms beneath libraries, forgotten archives filled with the same patterns of neglect. Each one was a reminder that history didn't just repeat, it leaked. But amid the endless repair work, he began to notice something else: small miracles. He saw them in the faces of kids who now studied in buildings filled with light instead of mold. He saw them in the murals that turned brick walls into memorials, in the teachers who refused to let the story of the six fade into myth. He saw them in his own children, Kesha and Marcus, growing up in a city that no longer looked away from pain. For the first time in years, Malcolm allowed himself to believe in the idea of forward motion. But belief, he'd learned, was dangerous. It made you think the ground beneath your feet was stable. One morning in early April, Malcolm was on his way to inspect the newly constructed Legacy 66 Academy, the rebuilt version of the old Eastbrook Middle, when he received a call from Detective Dana Ruiz. Her voice was tight, urgent. "We've got something," she said. "Not a body, not exactly, but you're going to want to see it." He turned the truck around without asking questions. Ruiz met him outside the Eastbrook Historical Society, a modest brick building near downtown. They were sorting old donations, she said, gesturing to a stack of boxes near the loading dock. Most of its junk: yearbooks, trophies, records. But this one. She led him inside. In the basement archive, a table held a single wooden crate. Inside were rolls of microfilm, a cracked Polaroid camera, and a binder marked property of Eastbrook Board of Education, 1971. Ruiz slipped on gloves and opened it. The first page made both of them fall silent. It was a list: names, ages, races, and handwritten notes beside each entry. The title at the top read Adjustment Program Candidates. The notes weren't academic, they were observational. Invasive. Tends to challenge authority. Displays excessive curiosity. Shows leadership potential. Monitor closely. Dozens of names. Most were black or Latino. Some, Malcolm realized, were the parents of the children he'd found in the pipes years ago. They tracked them, he said quietly, before they ever disappeared. Ruiz nodded grimly. This was systemic. Patterson wasn't selecting victims at random, he was continuing something that started long before him. They spent hours going through the files. Each name led to another trail: disciplinary reports, attendance logs, transfer records. It painted a chilling picture of an entire generation systematically labeled as problems and funneled out of opportunity. What Patterson did was monstrous, but the system that built him was methodical, bureaucratic, and almost invisible. The realization left Malcolm cold. He'd always believed he'd uncovered the full horror of Eastbrook, but now he understood that the killings were only the final symptom of a sickness that had infected everything long before. When the story broke, Eastbrook faced a reckoning deeper than any before. Parents demanded answers. Former students came forward with stories of discrimination and quiet removals. And the state launched an inquiry into historical misconduct in education. For weeks, Malcolm found himself at the center of it again: interviews, testimonies, press conferences. But unlike before, he didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a witness to something far older and wider than one man could ever contain. People think monsters hide in basements, he told one reporter. But the real monsters sign paperwork. Ruiz stood beside him during most of the hearings, her presence steady. She'd started to show the signs of time: slower steps, a softer voice, but her eyes were still sharp. "You know what this means, right?" she said one evening as they walked out of a courthouse surrounded by cameras. "This isn't just Eastbrook anymore. Every city's going to start digging." Malcolm gave a tired smile. "Good, let them. Maybe then we'll stop building over the same graves." Months later, when the inquiry concluded, the governor announced a statewide reparations program for families of the victims, both the 6 and those identified through the new investigation. Streets were renamed, scholarships created, and the educational board issued a formal apology. It was progress, but Malcolm couldn't shake the weight in his chest. Apologies were easy. Accountability wasn't. So when the Legacy 6 Academy invited him to speak at their reopening ceremony, he almost declined. It felt too neat, too polished, too far removed from the ugliness it was meant to honor. But Kasha, now 12, convinced him otherwise. "You always say stories matter," she told him, "so tell it right." On the day of the ceremony, the school was alive with color balloons, music, laughter. The smell of fresh paint mixed with the sweetness of spring flowers, planted around the new memorial garden. The gym was packed: parents, teachers, students, city officials, even reporters. When Malcolm took the stage, he didn't use notes. He just looked at the crowd, at the children sitting cross-legged on the floor, their faces full of curiosity and something he hadn't seen in a long time: trust. "This school was built on a grave," he began softly. "Not one you can see, but one we all feel. For years, this city forgot its children. It let them vanish into the dark, while pretending the lights were still on. But the truth has a way of coming back, even through pipes and concrete. And when it does, we have two choices: cover it up again, or face it." The room was silent. He took a deep breath. "We faced it. And because we did, this place can finally be more than a memorial. It can be a promise." His voice faltered slightly as he looked toward the mural of the 6 faces behind him. These kids: Mayadar, Talia, Desmond, Isabella, Jamal, they were more than victims. They were dreamers. They believed in a future where no one had to be forgotten. And now, it's our job to make that future real. When he finished, the crowd rose in quiet applause. It wasn't loud, but it was full of something heavier than noise: understanding. Afterward, as people mingled, Ruse joined him near the back. "You finally sound like you believe it," she said. Malcolm smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm learning to." She nodded. "Took you long enough." As the evening faded, Malcolm walked alone through the school's new hallways. The air smelled clean, the floors gleamed, and the walls were lined with photos of students past and present. He stopped at one display labeled Then and Now. On one side, the black and white portraits of children lost decades ago. On the other, color photos of today's smiling, alive scene. He felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time, the two halves didn't feel like opposites, they felt like continuation. Proof that memory could transform into motion. When he stepped outside, the sun was setting over Eastbrook, the sky streaked in red and gold. He stood there a long while, watching the light reflect off the glass windows of the academy. In the reflection he could see the new garden, the engraved names, and faintly, his own tired face. He thought of his father's words, the ones that had guided him since the beginning. "If you're going to fix something, fix it right." He whispered them into the wind like a prayer. "I'm still fixing it, Dad." Then he turned toward the parking lot, where his children were waiting, laughing in the back seat, calling for him to hurry. He smiled, the H in his chest softening into something else, not peace exactly, but acceptance. The city would keep leaking, history would keep surfacing, and he would keep following the sound of the water. Because some jobs, he knew now, were never really finished. By the next winter, the story of Eastbrook had already begun to drift from the headlines, replaced by newer crises and louder scandals. The world moved fast, too fast, and even pain had an expiration date in the public eye. But inside the city, where ghosts still walked between classrooms and beneath streets, memory stayed alive in quieter ways. Candles still appeared at the base of the Legacy 6 Memorial every December 12th, the day the bodies were found. Kids who hadn't even been born when it happened knew their names by heart. And Malcolm Reed, the man who had dragged the truth out of the ground, had become something of a myth himself, half hero, half warning. He never liked the attention. He still lived in the same modest house on Ashland Avenue, still drove the same beat-up truck, still carried the old wrench his father had left him. The world had changed around him, but Malcolm hadn't let it change who he was. He worked less now, mostly consulting for the Educational Justice Commission, though he spent more time speaking at community centers and mentoring young inspectors who wanted to follow in his footsteps. He told them the same thing every time: if you go looking for truth, don't expect it to be clean. It's never clean. One night, as snow fell thick over the city, Malcolm received a letter without a return address. Inside was a short note written in neat handwriting: "My grandfather worked at Eastbrook in the 1960s. He used to say there were rooms even he wasn't allowed to enter. I think I found one. Please come." There was an address scrawled beneath it: 1417 Barrow Street, a run-down property that used to belong to the district's maintenance department. He almost ignored it. He was tired, and winter storms weren't kind to his aging knees. But something in those words, "rooms he wasn't allowed to enter," itched at his curiosity. By morning, he was standing in front of the old building, the snow crunching under his boots. The place was collapsing in on itself, its windows boarded, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Malcolm used his flashlight to find a side entrance and slipped inside. The air was cold and dry, filled with the smell of dust and old paint. His breath fogged in the beam of light. The building had once been a maintenance hub, maybe even a storage facility, but now it was just hollow echoes and broken furniture. He searched room by room, floor by floor, until he found what he was looking for: a locked steel door in the basement corridor. The metal was old, pitted with rust, but the lock was new. Too new. He hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding harder than he'd admit. Then he pulled out his wrench, the same one that had opened the boiler room years ago, and struck the lock until it cracked. The door groaned open, releasing a breath of stale air. The flashlight revealed a narrow stairwell leading down. He descended carefully, each step creaking beneath his boots. At the bottom was a small chamber, maybe 20 feet wide. Along one wall stood a series of metal cabinets, each labeled with faded tags. He opened the first. Inside were folders, blueprints, inspection reports, contracts, nothing unusual. But as he dug deeper, the papers began to change. The language grew colder, coded. He found memos marked confidential with lines like subject placement approved and behavioral candidates transferred to Program East. The dates stretched back to the late 1950s. He felt the chill crawl up his spine. Program East, he whispered. He'd heard the name once before, mentioned in one of the Patterson journals. It had sounded like a myth, a ghost story told by bureaucrats. But here it was, real and stamped with official signatures. He snapped photos with his phone, documenting everything. Then he reached the final cabinet. It was smaller than the rest, secured by another lock. He pried it open and found a single box inside. Inside the box were 6 small envelopes. Each contained a clipping of hair and a handwritten tag with a name: Maya Carter, Andra Lewis, Talia Brooks, Desmond Price, Isabella Cruz, Jamal Green. For a long time Malcolm didn't move. The air felt heavier, pressing against his chest. The tags were dated months before the children's disappearances. His mind raced. Someone had documented them before they were taken, just like the names in the adjustment program files. That meant the killings weren't only acts of madness. They were continuations of an organized effort. One that survived through generations of quiet complicity. And somehow, the files had ended up here, hidden but preserved, waiting for him to find them. He called Dana Ruiz immediately. She arrived within an hour, her breath clouding in the frigid air. "You sure about this place being abandoned?" she asked, her eyes scanning the cabinets. "Seems like someone's been maintaining it." Malcolm nodded. "Lock was new. Someone's been keeping this quiet." Ruiz pulled on gloves and started flipping through the documents. Her face hardened. "Jesus, Malcolm. This isn't just Eastbrook. These reports mention half the districts in the state. Transfers, relocations, kids who disappeared on paper before they ever vanished in real life." She closed the folder slowly. "You realize what this means? It wasn't just one system failing. It was the whole damn network." They contacted the state's investigative unit, and by dawn the building was crawling with agents. What they uncovered would become known as the Barrow Street Archives. A massive trove of documents linking decades of discriminatory practices across multiple educational systems. The revelations shattered what little faith the public still had in the bureaucracy. Schools that had prided themselves on diversity were suddenly confronted with records of the children they had quietly erased. Reporters swarmed. Lawsuits piled up. But amid the chaos, Malcolm kept working, cataloging every document, tracing every name. He refused to let another truth be buried. Weeks later, when the press conference was held, Rue spoke first. "For years we told ourselves that evil ended with one man. We were wrong. Evil doesn't die, it adapts." Then she stepped aside, letting Malcolm take the microphone. He looked out at the sea of flashing cameras, his reflection mirrored in the glass windows behind them. "This city taught me that justice isn't about punishment, it's about honesty," he said. "You can't fix a system by pretending its cracks aren't there. You have to break it open, even if it means getting your hands dirty. That's how you make it hold." After the press left and the city settled into uneasy silence again, Malcolm returned to the Barrow Street building one last time before it was sealed for evidence. He walked down the same stairwell, the light from his flashlight trembling against the walls. He stopped at the empty cabinets, running his hand across the cold metal. It struck him then that this was how truth survived, not in grand speeches or polished memorials, but in the small, stubborn act of someone refusing to turn away. He thought of the 6 children again, their faces now carved into stone at the Legacy Garden, their laughter immortalized in murals. Maybe, he thought, they were finally free. Outside, snow began to fall again, slow and heavy. He stood under it, breathing the frozen air, watching as the flakes melted on his gloves. In the distance, the sound of the river carried through the quiet streets, a soft, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of a city still healing. Ruiz joined him, her coat bud tight against the wind. "You think this is it?" she asked. He shook his head. "No. There'll always be more to find, more leaks to patch." She smiled faintly. "Then I guess we'll keep the lights on." Malcolm looked out toward the horizon, where dawn was breaking over Eastbrook. The first rays of sunlight caught the rooftops, turning the snow into gold. He felt something stir in his chest, not peace exactly, but purpose. "Yeah," he said quietly, "we'll keep them on." And with that, he started walking, leaving footprints in the snow that stretched behind him like a trail of light through the dark. The spring after the Barrow Street discovery was one of those rare seasons when Eastbrook seemed to exhale. The snow melted early that year, and the river that once carried the city's waste now shimmered clean under the sun. The newspapers had quieted. The lawsuits were moving through their slow bureaucratic process, and for the first time in a long while, Malcolm Reed found himself without an emergency to answer. His phone, which had been a constant storm of calls for nearly a decade, now sat silent on the kitchen counter. Most people would have found comfort in that silence. Malcolm found it unnerving. He filled his days with work that felt almost ordinary, consulting on infrastructure projects, helping rebuild schools, mentoring new inspectors. But no matter what he did, he couldn't shake the sense that something was still unfinished, some loose wire humming beneath the calm. The Barrow Street archives had exposed decades of corruption, yes, but it also raised a question no one seemed eager to answer. Who had been maintaining that secret all those years? The documents had survived too well, preserved too carefully, for them to have been forgotten. Someone, somewhere, had been protecting the rot. He'd mentioned it to Detective Dana Ruiz a few times, but she'd brushed it off gently. "You've done your part, Malcolm," she told him over coffee one morning at the diner they always met in. "You pulled enough ghosts out of the ground for one lifetime." He smiled faintly. "You ever notice they keep crawling back, though?" She chuckled, shaking her head. "That's just because you keep inviting them." But even she didn't sound convinced. One evening in early May, Malcolm attended a city council meeting where the new Justice Education Initiative was being presented. The mayor praised the reforms. The board members applauded themselves, and the audience nodded in the rhythm of collective relief. Everyone wanted closure. But when the floor opened for questions, Malcolm stood up. "What happens to the rest of it?" he asked. "The records we haven't processed yet. The ones that don't fit neatly into the story you're retelling tonight." The room went still. The mayor cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed, those files are under state review. Everything will be cataloged properly." "Under whose review?" Malcolm pressed. "The same people who missed it the first time." The silence stretched. Cameras turned toward him. He could feel the discomfort ripple through the room. The mayor forced a polite smile. "We appreciate your vigilance, as always. But perhaps now it's time for all of us to move forward." That phrase, "move forward," echoed in his head for days afterward. It was what people said when they wanted to stop looking back. It was the sound of another door being sealed. That night, he drove through Eastbrook, past the memorials, past the rebuilt schools, past the murals of the 6 children whose faces watched over the city. He stopped at the river bank, where the water glowed under the streetlights, and sat there for a long time, thinking. He knew he couldn't move forward until he was sure everything had been uncovered. Closure meant nothing if truth was still buried. The next morning, he called Ruiz again. "You still have access to the Barrow Street evidence log?" he asked. "Why?" she replied warily. "Because I think there's something missing." There was a pause. "You were supposed to be retired," she said. "You were supposed to rest." "I'll rest when the leaks stop," he said simply. Together, they arranged a meeting at the State Records Facility, a cold, windowless building outside Lansing, where thousands of boxes from the Barrow case were stored. The archivist, a nervous young man, escorted them to a dimly lit easel. "Everything's been digitized," he said, "but some materials were restricted, chain of custody issues." Ruiz frowned. "Restricted by who?" The archivist hesitated. Department of Infrastructure Compliance. "You'd have to talk to their director." Malcolm's brow furrowed. That's my department. He signed the logbook and began opening the boxes himself. Most were filled with familiar documents, attendance reports, transcripts, transfer forms. But near the bottom of one stack, he found a sealed envelope marked confidential, do not release. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed and creased with age. It was a letter from 1983, addressed to Mr. H. Patterson. The signature at the bottom made Malcolm's heart stop. R.L. Bennett, former state education commissioner, the same man who'd founded the infrastructure vision Malcolm now ran. The letter was short: your work remains valuable to our objectives. Continue data collection discreetly. The department appreciates your discretion. He read it twice, then handed it to Ruiz. Her expression darkened. They funded him, she said quietly. They didn't just ignore it, they sponsored it. Malcolm nodded slowly. It's been inside the system the whole time. She took a deep breath. You can't take this public without proof. Then we'll find proof, he said. For weeks, they followed the paper trail, meeting in parking lots, cross-referencing old payroll records, uncovering hidden accounts that had funneled state money into research programs. Every step led closer to the same conclusion. The corruption hadn't ended in the past. It had evolved, passed from one administration to another, hiding behind new names and polished mission statements. The infrastructure division, the very agency Malcolm now represented, had once funded the same projects that destroyed those children's lives. The revelation shook him to his core. For years, he'd believed he was fixing what was broken. Now he realized he'd been repairing the machinery of the same system that had created the cracks. That night, sitting at his kitchen table with the evidence spread before him, he felt the weight of every pipe he'd ever opened, every secret he'd ever uncovered. All this time, he whispered, I've been patching leaks in the same rotten line. Ruiz called the next morning. You okay? She asked. No, he admitted. But I know what I have to do. She sighed. You're gonna burn it down, aren't you? Not burn, he said quietly. Flush? He spent the next week compiling everything: letters, memos, ledgers, payment transfers, and sent them to a journalist he trusted. One who had covered the original Eastbrook case with honesty and care. Within days, the story exploded. State Department linked to historic discrimination program. Protests erupted across Michigan. Officials scrambled to deny involvement, but the evidence was undeniable. Malcolm's name was everywhere again, this time attached to words like whistleblower and traitor. He lost his position, his pension, and his reputation among the state's elites. But he didn't care. He'd done what needed to be done. When Ruiz visited him a week later, she found him on his porch, sipping black coffee, watching the rain. You knew this would happen, she said. He nodded. Yeah. But maybe now, they'll finally clean it right. She sat beside him, quiet for a while. You ever get tired? He smiled faintly. Every day. But I'd rather be tired than blind. By summer, the governor had resigned, several officials were under investigation, and the infrastructure department was dismantled. Eastbrook, though scarred, had become a symbol of something rare in America, a place that refused to stop digging. Malcolm avoided the cameras this time. He spent his days rebuilding the small workshop behind his house, teaching local kids how to fix things: leaky faucets, broken locks, jammed valves. When they asked him why he bothered, he'd say, because fixing what's broken isn't just about water. It's about learning where the cracks come from. Late one evening, Kesha found him staring out at the street as the sun dipped below the rooftops. You did the right thing, Dad, she said softly. He smiled at her reflection in the window. Doing the right thing doesn't make it easier. No, she said, but it makes it matter. He turned, kissed her forehead, and whispered, that's all I ever wanted. Outside, the sky darkened, the first drops of rain beginning to fall. He listened to the sound of it hitting the gutters, steady and rhythmic, washing the dust from the rooftops. Somewhere beneath the city, the pipes hummed with the pressure of clean water, clear, unhidden, alive. For the first time in years, Malcolm let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, the flow was finally moving in the right direction. By the following autumn, Eastbrook had begun to resemble something new, a city not reborn, but rebuilt from its own bones. There were scars everywhere, visible and invisible, but there was also movement, people fixing what once seemed beyond repair. The Legacy 6 Academy had become a model for reform, and the words "We are still here" were etched above its entrance in bronze. For outsiders, Eastbrook was a story of redemption. For those who lived there, it was something harder to name, a delicate balance between grief and endurance. For Malcolm Reed, it had become both a graveyard and a classroom, a place that taught him every day how much it cost to tell the truth. After the Barrow Street revelations and the collapse of the State Department, Malcolm had disappeared from public life. Officially, he was retired. Unofficially, he was still working quietly, without fanfare, helping small towns investigate their own forgotten histories. People called him the man who listens to ghosts. He didn't mind the nickname. In fact, he'd come to believe that ghosts weren't spirits at all, but echoes of ignored voices, traces of lives that the world had refused to acknowledge. Every time he found another record, another sealed room, he felt those voices speaking through the rust and dust. They weren't haunting him. They were guiding him. It was late October when a letter arrived at his home, stamped with the emblem of a small county school district near Detroit. The handwriting was neat but urgent. "Mr. Reed, we've discovered an unregistered facility beneath our elementary school. No records exist of its construction. We've contacted the state, but no one will investigate. Please come." He stared at the letter for a long time. Part of him wanted to ignore it to let someone else answer the call. But curiosity had always been his curse, and duty his shadow. 2 days later, he was driving north, the city lights fading in his rearview mirror. The town of Maple Hollow was small, quiet, and poor, the kind of place that didn't make the news unless tragedy forced it there. The Larkridge Elementary School stood at the edge of a dying industrial park, its playground rusted, its flag faded. The principal, Mrs. Avery, met Malcolm at the entrance. "We didn't know who else to call," she said. "We were remodeling the gym when the floor gave out. There's a staircase underneath sealed off with concrete." She led him through the hallways, the echo of their footsteps hollow against the linoleum. At the edge of the gym, a gaping hole revealed the top of a staircase. The air rising from below was cool and heavy, like the breath of something ancient. Malcolm knelt, running his fingers along the broken concrete. The cut was deliberate machine work, not decay. "How long has this been here?" he asked. "Decades," Mrs. Avery said. "We checked the blueprints. There's no mention of a basement." He looked at her. "You call the police?" She hesitated. "They sent one officer. Said it was probably an old storage area. He didn't even go down there." Malcolm nodded grimly. "Figures." He spent the next day assembling equipment, a headlamp, camera, respirator, a crowbar for leverage. Mrs. Avery insisted on accompanying him, but he refused. "You have a school to protect," he said. "Let me handle the ghosts." When he descended the staircase, the air grew colder with each step. The walls were lined with cracked tiles, and the floor was slick with condensation. At the bottom, his flashlight revealed a narrow corridor leading to a single metal door. A faded sign above it read "Restricted Area Staff Only." He pushed it open. The room beyond was small, maybe 20 feet wide, with low ceilings and walls covered in peeling paint. In the center stood a row of old desks, their surfaces scarred by years of use. On one of them sat a tape recorder, thick with dust. Malcolm pressed play. Static filled the air, followed by a man's voice, calm, bureaucratic, detached. "Observation Session 12. Subject displays increased anxiety during isolation. Recommendation: extend monitoring period." Another voice, faint, younger, trembling. "Can I go home now?" Then silence. Malcolm turned off the recorder, his hand shaking. He scanned the room. On the far wall, faded photographs were pinned to a corkboard. Children, maybe a dozen of them, each labeled with a number instead of a name. Beneath them, a file cabinet stood slightly open. Inside were folders marked Behavioral Study Program Phase I. He sat down and read. The words were clinical, methodical, horrifying in their simplicity. The study had been part of a pilot program in the late 1960s, designed to observe social adjustment behaviors in at-risk youth. In reality, it was an experiment in isolation. Children kept underground for weeks, monitored through hidden cameras, their reactions recorded. Most were children of factory workers from nearby neighborhoods. None of their families had ever been told. Malcolm felt his stomach twist. This wasn't just neglect, it was cruelty disguised as science. He documented everything: photographs, audio, the layout of the room. Then he climbed back up the stairs, heart heavy, lungs burning. Mrs. Avery was waiting near the door, her face pale. "What did you find?" she asked. He hesitated, then said, "Proof. The kind no one will want to believe." She looked at him with wide eyes. "What do? We tell it," he said. "Even if no one listens at first." When he called Ruse later that night, she wasn't surprised. "You always find the worst things in the quietest places," she said. "You sure you want to go through this again?" "It's not about wanting to," he replied. "It's about not letting it stay buried." She sighed. "All right, I'll make some calls." Within a week, Maple Hollow was swarming with investigators. The tapes were sent to forensic labs, the documents were authenticated. The evidence was irrefutable. What they had found wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a series of covert psychological experiments conducted under the guise of educational reform. When the news broke, the state reeled once again. For the third time in 2 decades, Eastbrook's shadow stretched outward, forcing the nation to look at what it preferred to forget. Malcolm stayed in the background, avoiding interviews. He didn't want to be the face of another scandal. He was tired of being the man who uncovered nightmares. But he couldn't deny what he felt when he watched those children's photographs on the news: anger, grief, and something deeper: responsibility. The ghosts hadn't come to punish him, they'd come to remind him why he'd started this work in the first place. A month later, he visited the site again. The staircase had been sealed, the room preserved as evidence. The school planned to build a small memorial in its place. As he stood there, watching construction crews pour new concrete, he thought of how many times he'd seen this new foundations laid over old sins. Maybe that was the story of every city, every system. Not erasure, but layering truth buried under progress until someone bothered to dig. That night, as he drove home through the rain, he realized that his work would never truly end. There would always be another forgotten basement, another sealed file, another voice waiting to be heard. And maybe that was all right. Maybe some people were meant to be keepers of the cracks, listeners to the water that ran beneath the world. When he reached Eastbrook, the streets were slick with rain, reflecting the glow of streetlights. He parked near the Legacy Garden and sat there for a while, listening to the steady rhythm of water hitting pavement. In that sound, he heard everything: the past, the grief, the defiance, the promise. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "I'm still listening." And somewhere, deep beneath the city, it felt like the pipes answered back. Winter came early that year, sudden and bitter, wrapping Eastbrook in frost like a warning. The air was sharp, the river slowed to a thick gray current, and the streets, usually alive with chatter, grew quiet as people retreated indoors. To the rest of Michigan, the town had become a symbol of endurance, the place that refused to look away from its own reflection. But for Malcolm Reed, that reflection was starting to stare back too hard. He'd spent nearly 2 decades pulling truth out of concrete. And sometimes he wondered if he had become a little like the ghosts he'd freed, haunting systems that didn't want to remember. The Maple Hollow investigation had drawn national attention again, though Malcolm stayed out of sight this time. He let the younger inspectors and journalists handle the noise, while he slipped back into the shadows, helping Ruiz and a small network of trusted colleagues quietly trace the wider pattern. They found that the behavioral study wasn't limited to Maple Hollow. It had branches in several states, disguised as educational initiatives, social research projects, even youth mentorship programs. Each one had been buried under decades of red tape and renaming. Every time a story broke, the institutions responsible would issue the same rehearsed statement: that was another era. "We've learned. We've moved on." Malcolm no longer believed in eras. Evil didn't end when the headlines changed. It just adapted, like mold finding a new wall to spread through. He'd been staying at Ruiz's cabin on the edge of the city, a small, quiet place surrounded by bare trees and the faint smell of smoke from the wood stove. She had retired fully now, but her mind was as sharp as ever. The two of them spent nights talking over case files and coffee, the silence between them carrying a kind of mutual understanding. "You ever think about quitting?" she asked one night, flipping through a folder of old transcripts. Malcolm smiled tiredly. "Every day." And he shrugged. "Then I remember what happens when nobody looks." She gave a dry laugh. "You'd make a lousy retiree." They were supposed to spend the winter cataloging evidence for the Maple Hollow inquiry, but life had other plans. In late December, Ruiz suffered a mild heart attack. It wasn't serious, the doctor said, but it forced her into rest. Malcolm found himself caring for her, making soup, driving her to checkups. It felt strange, almost peaceful, to do something ordinary. One evening as snow fell softly outside, Ruiz looked at him over her cup of tea. "You ever wonder what your life would be been like if you never opened that pipe?" He thought for a moment. "Quieter," he said. "But emptier too." She smiled faintly. "You stubborn Reed. But I think the world needs stubborn people." While she recovered, Malcolm tried to step away from the work. He helped with maintenance at the Legacy 6 Academy, visited his daughter Kesha at college, even volunteered to teach a workshop for teenagers interested in public service. But the peace didn't last. In January, an email arrived from a university professor who'd been researching the psychological experiments from Maple Hollow. Attached were documents she'd found in a private collection, letters between state officials and a private corporation called Navacor Industries, which had funded several education partnerships in the late 1960s. The tone of the letters was chillingly familiar. "We appreciate the ongoing data. Continue to focus on behavioral compliance and response conditioning. Results have been promising." Navacor was still active, rebranded now as a tech consulting firm specializing in data analytics for schools. They managed assessment software used in hundreds of districts, including Eastbrook's. Malcolm read the documents 3 times, feeling that old dread stir in his gut. The ghosts weren't gone. They'd just moved online. He met with the professor, Geraldine Howard, in a coffee shop near Lansing. She was in her 40s, bright-eyed but wary, the kind of person who'd learned how dangerous truth could be. "They're recollecting data the same way they used to collect children," she said quietly. "Not bodies this time, but behaviors. Algorithms built on decades of biased research. The system rewards obedience and punishes resistance, even in code." Malcolm rubbed his temples. "History with a different face." She nodded, and the same silence. He went home that night unable to sleep. Every sound, the creak of the house, the groan of the pipes, felt like an echo from the past. He turned on the faucet in the kitchen, watched the clean water pour out, and thought about how fragile it all was. Clean one day, poisoned the next. Truth worked the same way. He called Ruiz the next morning. "They were doing it again," he said. She didn't ask for proof. "Where?" "Everywhere." They began digging together, quietly using their old network of reporters and inspectors. What they uncovered made his blood run cold. Navacor's software wasn't just tracking grades or attendance, it was monitoring student behavior, flagging non-compliant tendencies, and selling the data to third-party contractors for predictive analysis. The pattern was identical to the files from 50 years ago, only digital now, invisible, efficient. They turned a crime into an industry, Ruiz muttered when they reviewed the evidence. Malcolm felt sick. "They built a new basement," he said, "and nobody even knows they were in it." When they tried to alert the authorities, they were met with resistance. "These are standard educational practices," one official insisted. "You're seeing ghosts where there are none." That phrase stuck with him, seeing ghosts. He'd been hearing it for years, from people who didn't want to admit what was buried beneath their feet. But ghosts, he thought, only appear when someone's been ignored for too long. He decided to take the fight public again, though this time he wasn't sure how much he had left in him. The backlash was immediate: corporate lawyers, government denials, online smear campaigns calling him paranoid and senile. It didn't matter. The truth had already started leaking. Whistleblowers from Novacore came forward, teachers spoke out, and within months the company was under federal investigation. The story hit national media: digital eugenics, the hidden algorithm behind America's schools. It was bigger than anything Malcolm had uncovered before, and it terrified him. The world had changed, but the ghosts hadn't. They just learned how to move faster. He became the reluctant face of another movement, though this time his voice trembled when he spoke. They used to bury the bodies, he told one interviewer. Now they bury the data. But it's the same crime, the erasure of potential. Ruiz watched from home, pride and worry mixed in her eyes. When she called him after one of the broadcasts, her voice was soft. You've done enough, Malcolm. You've given them the truth. Let someone else carry it now. He didn't answer. He was staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the pipes. You ever notice, he said quietly, how no matter how many times we fix a leak, there's always another? She chuckled sadly. That's life, Reed. You fix what you can and pray it holds. As winter deepened, Eastbrook braced itself for the fallout. Schools began dropping Novacore contracts, state legislatures launched investigations, and Malcolm found himself once again both celebrated and condemned. But he didn't care about his name anymore. He only cared that the truth was still flowing, that people were finally paying attention. One evening, he stood outside the Legacy 6 garden as snow fell softly on the bronze statues of the children whose deaths had started everything. He brushed the snow from one of the names, Jamal Green, and whispered, "We didn't let it happen again." The wind answered, low and steady, carrying the sound of running water beneath the frozen ground. He closed his eyes and smiled faintly. For once, the ghosts felt quiet, almost at peace. When he turned to leave, the lights of the city glowed behind him, warm, flickering, alive. Eastbrook still had cracks, but it also had people willing to see them. That, he thought, was enough. The world would always leak. All he could do was keep listening. Spring came to Eastbrook like a long sigh after too many years of holding its breath. The city, once marked by decay and scandal, now pulsed with an uneasy kind of hope. The river ran clear for the first time in decades. The schools gleamed under new paint, and children's laughter echoed through streets that used to hold silence. To outsiders, it looked like healing. To Malcolm Reed, it felt like a truce, temporary, fragile, the calm that visits right before a storm remembers where it left off. He'd spent his life chasing leaks, fixing what others ignored, and now at 61, he could feel time catching up. His hands ached when he worked, his heart strained when he climbed stairs. But his mind still burned like a pilot light that refused to go out. He'd promised Detective Dana Ruiz he would slow down, maybe even write a book. She was older too now, her health fragile but her wit still sharp as a knife. They met once a week at the same diner, where they'd shared 100 secrets over the years. You need to rest, she told him one morning, stirring her coffee. You've earned it. Malcolm smiled without looking up. Rest is for people who trust the world to stay quiet when they close their eyes. Ruiz chuckled softly. And you still don't, huh? He shook his head. Not yet. It had been 6 months since the Novacore scandal unraveled. Laws were changing. The country was finally paying attention, or at least pretending to. Tech companies scrambled to rewrite their ethics codes. Schools purged their contracts, and Eastbrook became a national symbol again. This time for resilience instead of tragedy. There were awards, conferences, even documentaries. People kept asking Malcolm to speak, to give them wisdom about justice, redemption, truth. He turned down most of them. He didn't have the words anymore. What could he say that he hadn't already screamed through decades of evidence, grief, and broken doors? That the world leaks? That every generation forgets what the last one swore to remember? Some truths didn't need speeches, they needed maintenance. He spent his days quietly now, working on a community project called The Foundry, a hands-on repair and a mentoring program for at-risk youth. The building sat on the ruins of an old factory, its walls painted with murals of tools and constellations. as if fixing the world and understanding it were part of the same dream. He taught kids how to mend pipes, repair wiring, read blueprints, small things that built patience and pride. But the lessons weren't really about plumbing. Every system breaks, he told them one afternoon, leaning on his wrench. What matters is whether you walk past the leak or stop to fix it. The kids listened, nodding, some pretending not to care but storing the words anyway. One of those kids, a tall 15-year-old named Jalen Price, reminded him of someone he used to be, a mix of curiosity and defiance. The kind of kid who asked dangerous questions. Jalen had lost his father to the prison system and his mother to addiction. But he showed up every day, early, hungry to learn. One evening, as they were closing up, Jalen asked Mitza Reed, "Why do you care so much about fixing stuff that isn't even yours?" Malcolm smiled. "Because if it breaks again, it will be. Everything that's ignored eventually finds its way back to you." That night, he stayed late at the foundry, reviewing plans for a new water filtration project the kids had designed. It was simple but brilliant, using recycled materials to purify storm runoff before it hit the river. As he worked, he felt something he hadn't in years: peace. Not the kind that comes from winning, but the kind that comes from knowing you've done enough to keep the light on for a little while longer. He locked up, stepped outside, and stood on the cracked sidewalk, breathing in the cold air. The city hummed around him, alive and tired and beautiful. 2 days later, Ruiz called him. Her voice was faint but steady. "You sitting down?" she asked. He frowned. "Should I be?" "They're renaming a building after you," she said. "The state's putting your name on the new Environmental Research Center downtown." He laughed quietly. "You were kidding on. Not the Malcolm Reed Institute for Structural Justice." "You should have seen the mayor's face when they announced it." He was quiet for a moment, unsure how to respond. "I never wanted my name on anything," he said. "You earned it," she replied. "You gave this city back its conscience." He didn't tell her that conscience was just another word for pain you refused to ignore. The dedication ceremony came in late April. Crowds filled the square, reporters set up their cameras, and a new plaque gleamed beneath the spring sun. Malcolm stood beside Ruiz, her hand on his arm for balance. The mayor gave a speech, polished and sentimental, about truth as foundation and heroes who build beneath the surface. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped to the microphone and looked out at the faces, old, young, tired, hopeful. "This city has buried a lot," he began. "But what matters isn't what we've lost. It's what we've learned to uncover. Justice isn't built once, it's maintained every day by people who refuse to stop listening. If you hear something leaking, don't wait for someone else to fix it. Get your hands dirty. That's how the water stays clean." The applause came slowly, then swelled warm and human. Ruiz squeezed his arm. "Not bad for a plumber," she whispered. In the weeks that followed, Malcolm finally began to feel the weight of age. He moved slower, forgot small things, took more breaks during the day. But he didn't resent it. He'd spent his life running toward the sound of breaking things. Slowing down felt earned. He still visited the foundry every morning, still checked the pipes himself, even when his students rolled their eyes and told him to rest. He smiled at their impatience. It was the same impatience that had kept him alive this long. One night in early June, a heavy storm rolled over Eastbrook. Thunder shook the rooftops, and rain poured through the gutters, like a flood reclaiming what was once its own. Malcolm sat by his window, watching the lightning paint the city silver. The sound of water, steady and fierce, filled the silence. He thought of everything it had taken from him, and everything it had given back. He thought of the 6 faces on the memorial, of Ruiz asleep in her cabin, of the kids at the foundry carrying wrenches like torches into the future. He whispered softly, "You kept the lights on, didn't you?" The next morning Ruiz called, but he didn't answer. When she arrived at his house, she found him still by the window, the rain dried on the glass, his wrench resting beside his hand. He was gone, but the pipes in his house still hummed with perfect rhythm. The city still ran clean. The foundry still opened its doors. And across Eastbrook, People still listen for leaks, not out of fear, but out of respect for the man who taught them that truth, like water, always finds a way through. A week later, they buried him beneath the willow tree at the legacy garden. The children he taught carried flowers, and Ruiz, her voice trembling, read the words he'd once written on a scrap of paper: "Fix what's broken, even if it breaks you to do it." The wind picked up, soft and steady, rustling through the leaves like distant applause. That night, as the sun dipped behind the city, the streetlights flickered on one by one. Somewhere deep beneath Eastbrook, the water moved through the pipes, whispering the same promise Malcolm had lived by, that no truth stays buried forever, and no darkness can silence the sound of something finally running clean. The story of Eastbrook, of the 6 lost children of Malcolm Reed, isn't just a tale about horror unearthed or justice served. It's a study of endurance, of how truth, like water, finds its way through the smallest cracks, no matter how long it's been buried. The lesson is not neat or comforting. It doesn't promise redemption in a straight line or paint heroes without scars. Instead, it reminds us that evil is not always loud or monstrous. Most often, it's quiet, polite, and written in the language of bureaucracy and convenience. The tragedy of Eastbrook was never only about one killer or one corrupted system. It was about what happens when a community stops listening to its own walls, when it stops believing that small things matter until those small things become unbearable. The story teaches that every society builds its own basements, physical or metaphorical, and that what we hide down there eventually decides what kind of people we become. Malcolm's life is proof that truth doesn't arrive in grand revelations, but in persistence, the decision, again and again, to look where everyone else refuses. He was not a saint or a savior. He was an ordinary man who refused to look away, and that's precisely why his story matters. The world celebrates heroes who fight dragons, but it often forgets the ones who fix the leaks that lead to the dragons in the first place. Malcolm's strength came from his stubbornness, from the quiet belief that decency is a craft, not a gift. He understood that justice isn't a courtroom verdict, it's maintenance. It's showing up every day, wrench in hand, to keep the system from rotting. The lesson here is that integrity rarely feels triumphant, it feels exhausting. It asks for patience, not applause. But it's also the only thing that keeps the world from collapsing under the weight of its own indifference. Eastbrook itself becomes a character in this lesson, a city that mirrors the country around it. It shows how easily communities build monuments to victims while ignoring the conditions that created them. The people of Eastbrook wanted closure, but Malcolm refused to give them that comfort. He showed them that remembrance without accountability is just another form of forgetting. When the truth came out, the city didn't just face its past, it had to rebuild its present. And that is the hardest part of healing the work after the revelation. The part no one wants to do once the cameras are gone. The story reminds us that justice isn't about punishing villains, it's about rebuilding the foundation so that new ones can't grow. The pipes keep leaking because we keep treating symptoms instead of structure. Malcolm's life, and his city's pain, teach that fixing the leak is never as simple as replacing a part. It means admitting that the whole system might be flawed. Another lesson sits deeper still: the importance of memory, of bearing witness even when the truth feels unbearable. The people of Eastbrook learned that silence is not peace, it's decay. Every time the school board ignored a missing child, every time a neighbor dismissed a rumor, another layer of rot spread under their feet. Malcolm's journey forces us to ask an uncomfortable question: how many injustices survive not because of cruelty, but because of convenience? It's easier to believe the world is fine than to crawl into its crawl spaces and find out what's really there. The story shows that forgetting is not neutral, it's a choice that feeds the same monsters we claim to despise. Memory, on the other hand, is work. It's a discipline. And just like plumbing, it requires constant upkeep. Then there's the lesson of Dana Ruiz, whose steadfast loyalty and wary courage represent the cost of empathy in a broken world. She and Malcolm both learned that doing the right thing often means losing comfort, reputation, even hope. But they also discovered that courage doesn't come from fearlessness. It comes from choosing to keep going despite the fear. Ruse's quiet resilience, her refusal to let the system rewrite its sins, becomes a mirror for anyone who has ever had to hold a flashlight for someone else walking into the dark. The story of Eastbrook tells us that change is never the work of one person. It's the accumulation of small, stubborn acts by people who refuse to stop caring. On a broader level, the story speaks to America itself to the way its history keeps resurfacing, no matter how many layers of progress we pour over it. The pipes beneath Eastbrook are the country's own foundations built on labor, neglect, and buried pain. Every time the system clogs, it's not a surprise as it's a reminder. We keep inheriting the consequences of what we refuse to repair. Whether it's racism, inequality, or institutional cruelty, the leaks keep returning because we still pretend the damage isn't structural. Malcolm's story is a warning. If you don't look at the foundations, if you only ever patch the surface, one day everything will flood again. His wrench was never just a tool, it was a symbol, a call to stop decorating the cracks and start mending them. And yet, the story doesn't end in despair. Beneath all the tragedy, there's a lesson about possibility, about how small acts of integrity can ripple across generations. The foundry the youth center Malcolm helped build stands as proof that the past doesn't have to own the future. Every student he taught to fix a pipe, every child who learned to pay attention to what others ignored, carried a piece of his stubborn light forward. His death wasn't an ending, it was a passing of tools, a reminder that the work continues even when the worker is gone. The clean water that flowed through Eastbrook after his death wasn't just literal, it was moral, too. It represented the idea that even in a corrupted system, purity can be reclaimed drop by drop, if enough people are willing to get their hands dirty. Ultimately, the lesson of Eastbrook is this: truth is not a one-time discovery, it's a lifetime of maintenance. Justice is not a finish line, it's a rhythm, like the flow of water through a city's veins. It demands listening to the leaks, the silences, the stories no one wants to tell. It demands humility, because the moment you think you've fixed everything, the rot begins again. And it demands faith, not blind optimism, but the quiet kind, the faith that says, even if I can't clean it all, I'll clean what's in front of me. Malcolm Reed lived and died by that creed. He never chased glory, he chased clarity. He understood that the world doesn't need perfect heroes, it needs honest workers. People willing to crawl into the dark and make sure the light above keeps working. His story reminds us that every truth uncovered, every injustice named, every pipe repaired is a small act of defiance against the flood. And maybe that's all life asks of us in the end, not to stop the leaks forever, but to make sure the water runs a little cleaner for the ones who come after. If you enjoy stories that make you think twice before turning off the lights, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. There are still many things left unsaid, and we'll continue exploring them together.